Ivan Chernysya, Albrecht's youngest and most talented swordsman. For generations, the Chernysy family was the most prominent in the empire. The young lady said with a smile that she would be back soon. She knew she had to go to the imperial palace to see Ernst. The Albrecht Empire had a wonderful second prince, Ernst. When Ivan was little, their families made promises to each other for the future. The prince was her best friend. She didn't know exactly what this future meant, but because of it, she had to visit the imperial palace, often at the direction of adults. She thought about it for a moment and remembered how her sisters had always encouraged her before she left, but she was always told that she must be careful not to run into Prince Theodore. The young lady had heard many rumors about the first principle of Theodore. It was said that corpses were being raised from his palace every day. There was not a day that this did not happen. They said that he used living people as targets and bathed in the blood of innocent people. The young lady, nevertheless, decided to push all thoughts away and not think about such things. But still, this is what worried her most. She was afraid of meeting him. Black hair and sinister eyes so black that they were terrifying. In the Empire, black was considered an ominous color long ago. The Empire was attacked by a monster that tried to destroy people. And the black color symbolized ancient evil. Of course, you now considered it a legend. Everyone was wary of the black-haired prince, who was born into the imperial family. The young lady thought for a moment she knew all along that she would never meet him. The young lady didn't even notice how she arrived at the imperial palace. She slowly walked out. She didn't have time to greet the prince when he suddenly ran into her and hugged her. Prince Ernst said with a beaming smile that he missed her very much. Ivan pushed him away and said that he was going to strangle her, but the prince looked at her with a smile. The prince took the young lady by the hand and said with a smile that it was time for them to go into the garden and have some fun. Ivan told him to wait a little as she needed to greet Her Majesty. Ernst smiled and said that everything was fine since his mother was currently busy with a guest. The maids smiled as they looked at the children. Ivan sighed heavily at such moments. She felt like an older sister. The young lady sighed heavily as she was very hot. The prince said that they could play. The prince in turn wanted to play family, but Ivan interrupted him and asked if he wanted to play hide and seek. The young lady smiled and said that she would very much like to play hide and seek. The prince thought for a moment. A moment later, he agreed to play hide and seek with a smile, and Ivan was pleased. While the young prince was counting, Ivan quietly climbed the tree next to him. The young lady looked at her friend intently, wondering if he would find her here. She saw how far he had gone and said with a smile that she could now rest. She was surprised because she hadn't noticed how she had relaxed and felt sleepy. A moment later, she heard some rustling next to her and woke up. Opening her eyes, she froze as she saw a young boy in front of her. Coming to her senses, she was taken aback and shuddered. She did not expect to see anyone next to her. Because she fell asleep, she lost her voice, and Ivan wondered who he was since she had not seen him before. The young man looked at her in bewilderment, but a moment later he greeted her with a smile. Ivan was taken aback, but also greeted him with surprise. She was a little surprised, but still did not take her eyes off him, as he had a pleasant voice and face. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was smiling. The boy smiled and, moving closer to her, said that she looked very cute. The young lady froze. The young man saw that she blushed, and Ivan looked away from him in embarrassment. Ivan said sheepishly that it was just summer and very hot. She did not look at the boy. The young man began waving his hand near her and asked if she was okay with it. She looked at him in bewilderment as she was surprised, but still said that she was already better. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really slept there. She said that she had just been playing hide and seek with a friend. Ivan looked at the young man and asked what he was doing there. He sighed heavily and said that he was hunting for treasure. She smiled and said that she knew the game because she had played it, and if he had already found the treasure, he could stay here with her. But a moment later, the young lady began to sew for. She noticed that too much time had passed. She thought for a moment and said that it was time for her to go. For a moment, she felt sad because she didn't want to leave. The young man took her hand gently. Ivan looked at him in surprise. He asked her without looking at her if they would see each other next time. He was afraid to hear the answer. The young lady gave the boy a radiant smile and said that of course they would see each other. She smiled a radiant smile and said that she promised him that they would see each other again. The boy was surprised as he did not expect such a thing. He looked at her with embarrassment. A moment later, the young lady was already alone on the ground and saying goodbye to him. The young man stared at Yvonne as she walked away, and he quietly muttered that she was beautiful. A moment later, he burst into hysterical laughter and asked the men if she wasn't a beauty. The young man walked and thought about the beautiful lady. It seemed to him that she was like a doll. He saw her here for the first time. He remembered how she had said with a smile that they would see each other again. The man approached the prince and said that, as he had ordered, they had found all the criminals who had broken into the palace. The prince said that they should all be sent to the empress's palace. The knight hesitated and said that it would be very troublesome. The knight said that he heard that the second prince was missing. The young man frowned. The prince smiled and called the knight, who looked at his master in bewilderment. The prince smiled very brightly and said that he thought he was in love. The prince looked at his friend with bewilderment and with tears in his eyes asked where she had been. Ernst said that he suddenly lost her, and then he himself got lost. The young lady patted her friend on the back and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had fallen asleep in the tree. The young lady noticed she thought that her friend was really like a child. She remembered her new friend, who seemed very grown up to her. Yvonne sat and ate, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered that she forgot to find out the name of her new friend. The whole family looked at the young lady in surprise as her behavior was different. The young ladies whispered among themselves as they did not understand what was wrong with her. They thought that she was as if hypnotized in the palace. A moment later, the young lady stood up and, thanking them for the food, said that she would go first. The whole family looked after her in surprise. They did not understand why she was behaving like this. Madame looked closely after her granddaughter. She knew she had to talk to her. The young lady kept thinking about the day she met her friend, when his golden eyes sparkled brightly. She remembered how he had beamed after she had said they would meet next time. She remembered his soft and calm voice that still rang in her ears. The young lady did not understand what was happening to her. She had been seeing him all day. Just the thought of him made her heart beat faster. Turning around, she saw the old woman. She was surprised because her grandmother came to her, and the lady in turn looked intently at her granddaughter. Madame looked at her and asked if she was going to swing the sword again. Yvonne said that was true. The lady was in shock and did not understand how anyone could even hold this sword in their hands. She asked if it would not be better for her to take hold of herself. The madam said that it was not proper for a woman to play with a sword, and that it would be better for her to spend that time with the second prince. The young lady said it was useless. She knew her family were swordsmen, who still held that post. They were the sword of the empire, to which all members of the family, regardless of gender, held a sword in their hands. Yvonne said with a smile that she was also a member of the Chernicia family, and no one would stop her from fencing. The lady looked at her granddaughter with puzzlement, but everyone had already agreed. She sighed heavily and said that it was the curse of Chernicia, and since Yvonne had answered her quickly, she would not bring up the subject again. The young lady looked at her grandmother in surprise as she noticed that she was very worried about her. She knew that her grandmother was a good person, but she was too picky. The lady continually confirmed to her granddaughter that she was after all a lady and should behave appropriately. Madame said that it seemed that something happened while she was visiting the imperial palace. She asked if it was related to the second prince. The young lady looked at her grandmother in bewilderment as she did not understand what she was talking about. A moment later, Yvonne, taken aback, said that everything was wrong. The young lady hesitated and thoughtfully said that she needed to think about something. A moment later, Madame's face changed, and she said with a smile that in that case she would not disturb her. Yvonne and the second prince sat quietly sipping tea. The young lady puzzled that she had to visit the palace again. She remembered the conversation with her grandmother and realized that she was still against her taking up fencing. The young lady in turn wondered what was wrong with her grandmother, but still she was very bored sitting. While she was drinking tea, she still wondered if she would be able to see her new friend again. The lady looked at the prince and called him Yvonne, asked if he had ever seen a boy of small stature. She said that he had golden eyes and brown hair, and that he was also very handsome. Ernst was perplexed. A moment later, a servant approached the prince and called him Yvonne, thought that the boy might be working in the palace. The servant said that it was time for study. The prince was surprised, as he did not want to go anywhere at all. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that he could go while she took a walk. The prince said that it was dangerous to walk alone, as she might disappear again like last time. She said with a smile that she was in the imperial palace, and there was no danger here. The prince took her hand and asked her to promise that she would never go to the first prince's palace. The young lady looked at her friend in bewilderment, but still promised him this. Some time later, the young lady was sitting on the ground and screaming "E." She looked at her friend with confusion and shouted at him to come to his senses. Ernst in turn very much asked his friend not to go out alone. Finally, the prince sent the maids away, and the young lady wondered if she would be unable to walk alone now. The young lady walked slowly, but they irritated her. Yvonne thought that she needed to return to the mansion quickly. She frowned for a moment, thinking that she would hardly meet her friend. But a moment later, she saw something and ran off like lightning, throwing away her umbrella. She ran up and sat down next to her friend, who was on the ground. She was very excited. She screamed at him and asked him to come to his senses as he was unconscious. A moment later, the young man heard her calling him and tugged at her hand. Yvonne fell right into his arms. The young man smiled and said that they met again. The young lady looked at the young man with embarrassment, as she was very close to him. A moment later, taken aback, she pushed him away and screamed as she felt uneasy. She was in shock. She didn't understand what was wrong with him. She felt like her heart was about to jump out. The young man cleared his throat. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was really feeling ill. He smiled and said that he was fine, but he had a slight cold. He asked her what was new. The young lady ran up to him and said that it didn't matter at all now she saw his pale face. Yvonne knew that if she looked closely, she could see him shaking. She wondered if he had fainted because he was feeling unwell. The young lady took her friend's hand and said that they could go to the Empress's palace. She knew she could go to her friend and ask him to bring a doctor. The young man took his girlfriend by the hand and said that he did not want to go to the Empress's palace. She looked at him in bewilderment because she did not understand why he did not want to. She saw that he was trembling. He said that they could go to the first prince's palace. After his words, the young lady was dumbfounded. She remembered how her family told her to go to the imperial palace, but not to go to the first prince's palace. She remembered her friend, who asked her to promise him that she would never go near the first prince's palace. The young man looked at her with a pleading look and asked if she couldn't go with him. She looked at him with a smile and said that they could go wherever he felt comfortable. A moment later, she saw the maids chasing after her. The maids saw the young lady with the young man and were dumbfounded on the spot. The maid wanted to tell her something, but Yvonne interrupted her and said that they had arrived just in time. She said that she would like to accompany the young man to the palace of the first prince and asked if they could not tell Ernest, as he would be very worried. The maid wanted to object, but she saw the prince's angry gaze on her, trembling. With fear, she agreed. The prince looked at his friend and said that they needed to hurry. Yvonne looked at the maids in bewilderment. Ernst sat in class, but he was very bored and uninterested. He wanted to finish quickly and go play with his girlfriend. The prince and the teacher looked back. Because they saw a frightened maid, they were in shock. A moment later, a maid rushed in and said that they were in big trouble. The prince froze in place when he heard that something bad had happened to his girlfriend. The young lady asked her friend if he was okay and where his room was. The young man pointed out the direction, and the young lady noticed that this was all very strange. Yvonne noticed that the palace was no different from the others in appearance, but for some reason, she did not see anyone alive. She asked if he worked here, and also if he had seen the first prince. The young lady said that she was just curious. She said that she was told to be careful with the first prince, as everyone hated him for his black hair. Yvonne said that she would secretly ask someone to transfer him to another palace. The young man was surprised. She asked if he was in such a bad condition, because the first prince left him to work a lot. He said that it was not so. He said that the prince was not such a bad person at all. Yvonne looked at him in surprise and asked if that was really true. She smiled and said that she was very glad about it. The young man looked at her in bewilderment. He was embarrassed. She smiled and said that meant rumors were just rumors, and the prince might not be such a bad person. She smiled and asked his name, since they didn't even know each other's names. The young man looked at her with embarrassment and wanted to say his name, when suddenly he heard a noise. Ernst ran up to them and shouted at the top of his lungs. He didn't want to see his girlfriend in such a place. The young lady was surprised. looked at her friend and asked how he came here. The prince looked at the young man, and with tears in his eyes, asked him to return Yvonne to him. Ernst, with tears in his eyes, begged his brother Theodore to return his girlfriend to him. The young lady froze in place. A moment later, she pulled away from her friend and asked him what Ernst was talking about. She looked at him in shock and asked if he really was the first prince. Theodore, without looking at the young lady, asked if it was really that important. She froze in place but did not answer as she was shocked. The young man looked at his girlfriend and said that everything was correct, and he was Theodore Leone Albrecht. Looking at the young man, she clearly saw his black hair as dark as the night sky. She was shocked and couldn't believe that he was really the first prince. He looked at her and softly said that he understood everything. The prince reached out to her, but she pulled away and he looked at her in shock. The prince asked if she was afraid of him too. He wanted to touch her. Ernst stood between them and shouted, preventing the prince from touching the young lady. The prince, with the speed of lightning, grabbed his girlfriend by the hand and ran with her. Yvonne shouted to him, but it was all in vain. She cast a white glance at the first prince, who was left alone. He said angrily that this was the reason he wanted to hide everything. He was irritated by such a reaction. The prince looked at his friend and asked if it was true that nothing had happened. Yvonne sighed heavily and said that nothing had happened. She had simply helped the prince because he was not feeling well. Yvonne said that she simply took him into the palace. Ernst asked if it was true. Ernst looked at his friend and asked if it was possible that the prince had forced her to remain silent. Yvonne was taken aback and shouted that it was not so. The young lady came closer to the principals and told him to look in turn. He was confused. Yvonne said in all seriousness that she was fine and there was nothing wrong. She said that nothing had happened to her and asked if he understood. Ernst sheepishly said that he understood. The butler knocked on their door and told the prince that it was already late and it was improper to stay in the girl's room for so long. The butler, with a sweet smile, watched as the young people forgave. The butler looked at the young lady and said that he was very glad that she had returned safely. The butler looked at her intently and wished her good night with a smile. The young lady was puzzled. She did not know why everyone was pretending that she had been captured by the devil himself. She knew that the prince had not done her any harm, because she felt that he was not like that. She stepped out onto the balcony, took a breath of fresh air, and wondered why everyone thought so badly of the prince. She knew he was a man who was not what the false rumors said. Yvonne remembered the warm smile he gave her. The young lady remembered how she left him alone and walked away. She really wanted to meet him again. Looking out the window, the young man sighed heavily. He was puzzled by the whole situation. A few days later, the young lady visited her friend and his library. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. He said that he was busy now and asked her not to say his name. Yvonne asked if he was playing some kind of game. The prince was shocked as he knew it was not theirs. He looked at her and said that he was protecting her because he didn't know when the man, his brother, would show up. She asked if he didn't need to study. She asked if he had time to play. Ernst said that everything was fine and that today was a day off, but the young lady knew that he was lying. She sighed heavily and said that she understood him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was looking for. The young lady looked at the books and asked if there was a book about the history of the country 10 years ago. The prince looked at the books and said that the one she needed was the last one in the corner. The young lady was glad that she had found the book she needed. The prince asked in surprise why she needed the book. The lady knew that she needed the book in order to get better information about Theodore. But she didn't say that. She hesitated. She said that she was just interested in history. The young man looked at his friend and gave her his radiant smile. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what was the matter. The young man, in turn, knew that his girlfriend would fall in love with him when he began to conquer countries. He understood that she had suddenly become interested in their empire. "Prince, I think she is already preparing to become his princess." He thought about it with embarrassment. The prince told her not to worry, as he would do his best to be a good emperor and husband. The young lady looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was talking about her husband. Taken aback, Yvonne looked at him and asked what he was talking about. She angrily asked what kind of wedding they were talking about, since she had never heard of such a thing. And the prince became frightened looking at her. She said that marriage should be with the person you love. A moment later, she pushed her friend away and ran away, the prince shouting at her to stop. He looked out from behind the bookcase and called out to her, as she thought she was nearby. But a moment later, he froze because he did not see his girlfriend. The young lady, meanwhile, was already sitting quietly on the tree. A moment later, someone covered her mouth with a hand. The young man said that it was he. The young lady, in turn, heard a familiar voice. Turning around, she saw the prince. He smiled, and asking for forgiveness, said that he could not restrain himself, and came to her. Ernst looked for his girlfriend everywhere, but he couldn't find her, and this depressed him. A moment later, he shouted at the top of his lungs and asked where she was. Ernst was upset that he couldn't find her. The prince sighed heavily and asked where she had gone. A moment later, he heard a voice and was taken aback. The man asked why he was there. The man looked at the pensioner with anger and asked how long he had been there. The man said that today they would study twice as much, so the prince only needed to focus on studying. The prince was shocked and screamed. The prince asked someone for help. Ivan and Theodore watched the prince and laughed. The young lady smiled and said that she thought the prince had left because she knew he had missed his classes. Turning around, she noticed that she was too close to the prince. The prince asked in embarrassment, to put it more simply, and the young lady was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. The prince looked at her and asked if she felt uncomfortable around him. The prince looked at her and timidly said that he did not want to hide it on purpose. Not understanding his look, he said that she should know that black hair frightens everyone, and that was his sad fate. He said timidly that he couldn't tell her about it right away because he was afraid of scaring her. Ivan began to slap her cheeks. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and asked what was wrong. After asking for forgiveness, the young lady asked if she could leave him for a while. He looked at her puzzled and said that, of course, it was possible he was surprised and did not understand what was wrong with her. Ivan said that she does not believe these rumors at all since she knows him personally. She smiled a soft smile and said that he turned out to be not that kind of person. She looked away timidly and said that, frankly, she really felt a little uncomfortable. The young lady said sheepishly that she had been too rude then. Ivan looked at the prince and timidly said that she was very sorry that everything turned out this way. She asked if they could make peace. The prince stared at the young lady in surprise. A moment later, he said that they could, of course, make up. The prince, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and wondered if he had ever been happy. Reaching out to the prince, she said with a smile that she missed him very much. Her world had completely changed after meeting him. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if her dress looked good. The prince, pouting, said that it matched. He was a little puzzled. She asked if he could put a different clip on her hair, and the coach said it looked good on her. He asked if she would really dress so nicely every day. Now she said that only during school. The young lady smiled shyly and said that she was very bored living in the imperial palace. She flew out of the room and said that she was going for a walk, and also wished him good luck in his studies. The young man was shocked and shouted after her, but the young lady was hurrying to meet him. After the day they made peace, she made an appointment with Theodore herself. No one knew about their secret place, except for them. The prince greeted his girlfriend with a smile. The young lady looked at him and said that he came earlier than her today. He smiled and said that he came recently. The prince looked closely at his girlfriend and said with a smile that she looked great today. The young lady asked in surprise if it was true, as she came in ordinary clothes. He said that she was the most beautiful of all he had seen. It was very boring in the imperial palace, but every day she met her friend, and they talked a lot and had a good time. She looked at her friend in surprise and asked what he did with his hair. He smiled and said it was magic. The prince said that his father didn't like it because he asked to put magic on his hair. Ivan wanted to ask her friend about many things, but when she saw that expression on his face, a lump stuck in her throat. She smiled and said she liked them because they looked like the night sky. Theodore asked who it was that said they were ominous. She said that it was already in the past, since she saw him in person and understood everything. The prince asked in surprise what was wrong with her hands. The prince said they were very different from other noble ladies. She said the calluses were caused by the sword. The young lady looked sheepishly at her friend, who was holding her hand. A moment later, the prince kissed her hand tenderly. Ivan was in shock. Her heart was pounding wildly. He said it was proof of her work and asked how it could be ugly. A moment later, he saw the scar on her arm. He noticed that the scar was emitting a trace of dark magic. He was surprised because he knew that the only ones who could use that level of power were Chernesia. She smiled at her friend and said that everything was fine and asked if he could listen to her. The young lady said with a sad smile that her story was a bit sad. Not long ago, there lived a man who greatly missed his dead wife. He was so bored that every single day he drank away all this grief and even took many similar women for his own. And he had a child born from his big mistake. The young little lady, who was innocent, was her father's mistake. Unfortunately, her family was very poor during her childhood, and they had to survive. Her mother was the only one she had, and unfortunately, she suddenly fell ill. She felt worse and worse. She felt very sorry for her mother, and she was worried that her mother was sick. But unfortunately, she was still a child and couldn't do anything. One such day, men came to them and angrily asked when she was going to repay the debt. They shouted that if she could not repay the debt, she should give up her daughter. The young lady screamed and called for her mother. She grabbed the first thing that came to hand and threw it angrily at the man. She angrily told him not to yell at her mother. The man was taken aback and froze in place. He was in shock, did not understand what had happened. The fork got stuck in the wall, which the young lady had thrown at him. But a moment later, Yvonne saw the men leave her house in a hurry. Her mother froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing from her daughter, but later looked at her with a smirk. The young lady looked at her mother in bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened at all. Some time later, the woman came to an audience with the Chernezy family and said that she had their child. She said that her young lady used force, and she saw it with her own eyes. The man angrily declared that this was nonsense, but his father told him to calm down. A few minutes later, the man approached the girl and sat down next to her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was sure she was the child of their family. The woman looked at them and asked if they could give her money in that case. Yvonne looked at her mother in bewilderment. The man said that he would prepare a room for her so that she could live peacefully for a while. The young lady reached out to her mother, but she left in a hurry. The man gently stroked the young girl's head and said that today they were her family. Yvonne watched her mother leave with tears in her eyes. The man looked kindly at the young lady and smiling said that she was now Yvonne Chernesia. He updated himself and said that from now on this was her new name. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, but did not answer. He smiled and said that since he was her family, she could call him Grandpa Gunther. So she got into their family and became a member of Chernesia. After that, her life changed a lot. The young lady was very surprised, but at the same time very happy, because she had people who loved her. As a member of the Chernesia family, she was trained in fencing. Yvonne was happy and worked tirelessly. She was also taught manners and etiquette, and all family members never stopped caring for her. At that moment, she learned what a real family was, and she was incredibly happy about it. But unfortunately, the wounds all over her body became more and more. Sometimes when her father thought about his dead wife, he completely denied her existence. She smiled and said that they say that scars left by a sword can be removed with holy power. She asked if her story was too hard. She smiled and told him not to worry. She said that her grandfather fortunately noticed everything, and he angrily shouted at his son that he was disgracing the family's honor by using violence. The young lady smiled and said that he had punished his father and driven him away. She smiled, looking at her friend, and said that everything was fine. The young lady said that he didn't have to make that expression. A moment later, she hugged him tightly. Yvonne thought he was a complete fool to be so upset. She thought she should smile as if nothing had happened, as she was worried that they would not be able to meet because of this story. She knew his story and how he had remained in the shadows after his mother's death. Yvonne knew that in the imperial family, he was simply an abandoned child. The young lady wondered if she could be like him. Her heart ached greatly just thinking about it. She looked at her friend and asked with a smile if he wanted to go to Chernesia. He looked at her in surprise. The young lady smiled and said that although it was noisy, her whole family was very friendly, and they were good people. She smiled and said that she really wanted to introduce him to them. The prince looked at her in surprise, but a moment later, he said with a smile that he would like to go and meet them. She smiled and said that in that case, she would send him an invitation. The young lady ran into the room because she knew that she was very late today. She was puzzled because she lost track of time while being with her friend. Approaching the door, she saw the Empress in all her glory. She smiled and said that she needed to greet her properly. The empress smiled and said that everything was fine, and there was no need for that. The young lady looked at the empress in surprise and asked what she was doing here. The empress said that she had heard from her son that Ivan was out late every day. The empress said that she should be careful because she was worried. Ivan thought that her friend was a real snitch. She smiled and asked the empress for forgiveness. The empress came closer to the young lady and said in a threatening tone that it would be good if she understood her place. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the empress in bewilderment. A moment later, the young lady looked after the empress. The empress, asking for forgiveness, said that they would see each other next time. The empress left, but the young lady in turn stood in bewilderment, looking at her trail. She was stunned by these words. The empress knew that even if Ivan was an illegitimate child, she could not be fooled. She knew that the young lady had to be on their side. Since she was now being threatened by the first prince, she froze in place upon entering the room. The prince smiled, looking at the empress, and asked if she had already arrived. The empress froze in shock. She did not understand what was happening here. She could not believe what she saw. The prince smiled and said that he saw a rat following him, but he quickly dealt with it. Theodore came closer to her and threateningly told her that she needed to stop. He removed the blade with magic, looked at her with fury, and told her to stop acting like that. The prince said that no matter how many assassins she sent to him, it was all useless since he killed everyone with ease. The empress looked at him angrily and asked what his intentions were. The prince said that, to put it simply, it was a declaration of war, since he had found what he wanted. The prince looked at the empress and said with a grin that he would have to take the throne. At this time, the second prince was attacked by a mercenary. The prince, in turn, froze in shock. The prince looked at the mercenary lying on the floor with tears in his eyes. The young lady looked at the man in shock and asked why this man was in the imperial palace. A moment later, the butler burst into the room with the knights. He shouted to the prince and asked if he was okay. The butler looked at the young lady and asked if she was hurt. Ivan sighed heavily and said that she was fine. The butler told her to come to him as he wanted to lead her to safety. The young lady looked down, wondering if Theo was okay. She wanted to check on him. But suddenly, she remembered how the empress had told her that she should know her place. She remembered her friend who gave her a radiant smile and said that he would wait for her invitation. After asking for forgiveness, she ran out of the room and said that she needed to check something. The butler and the prince shouted after her, but she did not listen to them because she knew that she had to see Theodore. The young lady rushed to her friend. She hoped that he would be okay. A moment later, she froze as she felt someone behind her. Turning around, she saw a man falling to the ground and the prince covered in blood. The young lady looked at her friend happily and shouted she was glad that he was alive. She ran up to him and asked if he was okay. She asked if he was hurt because the imperial palace had been attacked. The young lady pulled back and saw blood on her hands. The prince said he was fine, and it wasn't his blood. She remembered the rumors that were circulating around him. People said that every day a mountain of corpses was taken out of the prince's palace. The young lady sighed heavily. She did not understand why she suddenly remembered this. The prince looked at her and called out. He asked with a smile if she was really scared. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later said with a smile that she was not afraid. Theodore walked up to his friend and hugged her tightly. She called out to him in bewilderment. The prince said that she invited him to her place, but it seemed that he would not be able to visit her for some time. He said that he promised that as soon as the time came, he would take her away. Theodore asked her to wait for him. The young lady hung quietly on his chest. He smiled and kissed her hand tenderly. Time passed, and the incident at the imperial palace was resolved. Several months had passed since then. The young lady remembered little from that day. When she touched her friend's hand, she immediately fell asleep, and when she opened her eyes, she was already at the estate. She sent a letter to her friend, but there was no answer. The atmosphere in the mansion became very heavy. Her grandfather was in shock and did not understand why they started to destroy his family. She knew that hard times were coming. The cold winter passed, and her family was caught up in a sudden betrayal and disappeared from history. 10 years passed. The lady was leisurely walking around the Ferdinand estate. The man asked Eva if she was too late. The men whispered among themselves and did not understand why she was acting so calmly. His companion said that there were rumors that she was a master of fencing, but was hiding it. The man was shocked and asked if it was true, saying that it was simply impossible. The young lady looked out the window and noticed her reflection, which soon reminded her more of a man than a woman. The young lady screamed at her brother to let her go, as she could fight too, but he did not listen to her. With tears in her eyes, she begged him to let her go, as she did not want him to die. A moment later, he shouted angrily and called her name. The young lady was taken aback and looked up at her brother. He lowered her to the ground and, writhing in pain, told her to run. She saw that he no longer had the strength. He said that he and everyone else could not escape. He told her to run to the ends of the earth. He said that someday, when the time comes, she must wash away the shame from their family. The young lady looked at him, dumbfounded with tears in her eyes. He said she was their last hope. He begged her to continue living. The young lady woke up covered in sweat from a terrible nightmare. Memories from the past haunted her in her dreams. She stood up and sighed heavily, and after a few minutes she burst into tears, as it was painful for her to remember the past. That day, she was saved from a terrible fire by none other than the second Prince Ernst. The dejected young lady sat on the ground and screamed for no one to come near her. Her friend was calling her. She was shaking with fear, and with tears in her eyes, she said that her entire family had died in the fire. The prince looked at his girlfriend and burst into bitter tears. He was very sorry that everything turned out this way. He came closer to her and hugged her. He asked her for forgiveness. The prince said that he promised his mother that he would save only her. He told her that everything would be fine. After these events, she became part of the Ferdinand family. These were relatives of Ernst Rudolf, the empress's elder brother, looked at the young lady and said that he had heard of her. He said that she was the youngest swordswoman in the empire and the last of the Chernesia line. He came closer to her and told her to forget her past name and that she was now an orphan that he had picked up off the street and taken home. He said that she had better remember well to whom she owed her life. Rudolf grabbed her hand and felt a strange energy. He was surprised because he noticed that she had the holy power of Robrathi. He could not believe it, since it was supposed to disappear from the face of the earth with the death of the last patriarch of the Chernizy family. He said that he would put a spell on her if anyone tried to call her by her real name, they would die. Thus began her life in hell. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. Lady Katarina looked at her with disdain and asked if she was deliberately ignoring her. The young lady was taken aback and said that everything was wrong since she simply did not hear her. Katarina Ferdinand asked if this was her excuse. The young lady is the daughter adopted by the head of the Ferdinand family. The young lady looked at her father and said that he told her to give her a special gift. He smiled and asked if she had decided what she wanted, as he wanted her to be happy. She looked at him with a smirk and pointed in the direction of the young lady. She said she wanted that child. Katarina was the woman who took her life into her own hands. A moment later, the young lady slapped Eva across the face with fury. Katarina looked at Eva with contempt and said that she had not liked her for a long time. Katarina said that she behaves like a noblewoman and looks down on everyone. Katarina said that Eva was just a slave who became a knight's apprentice. The young lady asked with a smirk if there was something she didn't like. She said it would be nice to just cut off her head. Katarina said that this was the empress's generosity, and it would be bad if she disobeyed her. A moment later, the young lady looked away as she heard someone calling her. Looking back, she saw Benjamin walking towards her, looking at her intently. He looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was doing. Benjamin, son of Rudolf external head, Ferdinand. The young lady smiled as she looked at Benjamin and said that she was just teaching her. Benjamin looked at the young lady with fury and asked who gave her permission to do this. She said that Eva was a gift that the previous leader gave her, so she belonged to her. The young lady looked at him with a smirk and said that if he paid a fair price, she would not touch her. Eva thought about the price for a moment. She was confused. Benjamin sighed heavily and said that she had already begun her work, and Emperor Theodore would arrive soon. Eva was taken aback when she heard about the emperor's imminent arrival. The lady said with a grin that the story was finally starting to make sense. She looked at Benjamin and bowed, saying that she would do everything possible to keep her word. Benjamin came closer to the young lady and saw her face holding out his hand. He told her to look up and show him her face. Benjamin looked at the young lady in surprise and saw that she had tears on her face. Eva in turn remembered how Theodore told her that the day would come and he would come for her. She was in shock and wondered if he would come. Benjamin looked at the young lady and said that everything was ready. He smiled looking at her and said that fortunately, there would be no scar left. The young lady did not react in any way. A moment later, Benjamin said that he would give her medicine and she would need to take it regularly. Eva did not let him finish and called out. She asked what deal he had made with Katarina. She didn't want him to get into trouble because of her. She said that she already owed him a lot. Benjamin came closer to her and taking her by the shoulders, called out to her, since she did not listen to him and continued to talk. Benjamin hugged her and gently told her not to worry, as everything was fine. He said that he had enough patience and strength to take her away from Katarina. As he hugged her, he tenderly told her that when the time came, she should tell him her real name. 10 years ago, on a cold winter day, he met a little girl flying over the estate. He felt something. A moment later, the young man smelled the distinct scent of blood. Some time later, he arrived at the place where the thick scent of blood was coming from. But he saw a small child. Coming closer, he saw a little girl with tears in her eyes. He noticed that the smell of blood came from snow-white hair, pure as snow. He looked at the little girl with embarrassment, as this was their first fateful meeting. Benjamin came closer to her and said that there was no place for a little girl like her. Benjamin told her to go home quickly, but the young lady did not answer. A moment later, she burst into tears. Benjamin looked at her dumbfounded. He timidly said that he did not want to ask this since he saw her condition. He came closer to her and quietly began to wipe away her tears. He smiled and said that his name was Benjamin, and also asked what her name was. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Benjamin, in turn, listened to a crying voice that had difficulty pronouncing the name. She said that her name was Eva Llewellyn. The young man knew that this was a lie because he immediately noticed it. He learned the story of this child shortly after their meeting with her. The Empress and her brother talked and discussed that the girl was not harmed. The man said that they would take care of the vessel because this was exactly why it all was started. He said that, moreover, it is enough for them, Chernimya's illegitimate child, if they use her as a sacrifice. Benjamin overheard their conversation. He realized that the girl was from a family that had recently disappeared. He realized that she had lost her home and family, but still survived. He smiled because he was embarrassed. It was the first time for him. It was the first time Benjamin had ever cared for someone and healed a young lady's wounds. He sang her lullabies to keep her from having nightmares, and he always held her hand tenderly. He knew it was love. The young lady then became a knight's apprentice, after which the Empress, who considered her a victim, was killed. And Benjamin, in turn, became the head of the Ferdinand family. He was happy with his position. And in the process of all this, Theodore became the emperor of the empire. To Benjamin, none of this mattered, because Eva was his. Benjamin entered Katarina's room. The maids were perplexed. He looked at them and told them to all leave. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he had come to hers. Benjamin looked at her with fury and said that she had damaged Eva's face. She smiled and told him not to thank her. Benjamin looked at her in confusion and asked what she was talking about. Katarina looked at him with a grin and asked if that wasn't a reason to court Eva. She looked at Benjamin with a fierce grin and said that he wanted her. Katarina looked at him intently and said with a smirk that she would give him a chance to do so if she became empress. Looking at Benjamin, she asked if this wasn't their promise. He looked at her intently, but didn't answer. The young lady came to the garden. She said with a smile that she came here again when she often had a headache. She came to their place. She remembered young Theodore, who always greeted her with a smile on his face. With the grace of a cat, she climbed the tree. The young lady sighed heavily. She wondered if Theodore remembered her. She knew that, even if he did not remember her, she would remember him with all her heart. She knew that if anyone knew her identity and name, she would die. She knew that as long as this curse existed, she could not tell her name. She couldn't reveal her true identity to anyone, because she didn't want to see other people die anymore. But she still wanted Theodore to know who she really was. She knew that when she saw him, she would feel very bad, immersed in her thoughts. She did not notice how the branch on which she was sitting cracked. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand why the tree broke so suddenly. She fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady fell right into the arms of the young man. She closed her eyes because she thought she was falling to the ground. Opening her eyes, she froze in shock as she saw Emperor Theodore in front of her. She thought that he still remembered her name. In turn, the knights walked around the area and looked for the emperor they shouted. But everything was clear, and they were perplexed, and did not understand where he had disappeared to. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her friend. She could not take her eyes off him because she knew that it was he. She touched his face tenderly. The emperor was shocked because he did not expect such a thing. Theodore wanted to call her by name, but she remembered that she was under a curse. She knew she couldn't let him call her by name. With the speed of lightning, she covered his mouth with her palm. The emperor froze in bewilderment. A moment later, they found themselves on the ground. Theodore looked at the young lady in surprise. Eva, in turn, knew that there were two conditions for activating Rudolph's spell. First, if someone recognizes the name Ivan Chernishi. Second, if she herself says it. She was shocked because she realized that he recognized her, but she also knew that until he says her name, the spell will not activate. She thought it would be better for her to just run away. Her hands were shaking. The emperor, in turn, looked at her in surprise and intently. But a moment later, she found herself beneath him with ease, and he smiled and said that she was a knight with a cheerful spirit. Theodore came closer to her and said that he liked it. He smiled and asked her name. She was confused and wondered if he didn't remember her. The young lady realized that in his eyes, she looked like a man and nothing else. A moment later, she knelt before him and begged for forgiveness, saying that her name was Eva Llewellyn. She was glad that he did not recognize her. But at the same time, she felt sad. The emperor looked at her intently with a smirk on his face. The young lady apologized and said that she did not recognize him. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew that his name was Theodore. The young lady was taken aback. She wondered how she could know his name, considering that they had not met. Before she said that she saw his royal family symbol, she said that there were rumors that His Majesty Theodore had beautiful black hair. The emperor froze in surprise. Theodore said that, in that case, he would like to ask her for a favor. Eva asked in bewilderment what he meant. He looked at her and said with a smile that he would like to take a look at the place where he was staying. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he really wanted to see where he was staying. He smiled and said that was right. The emperor smiled a radiant smile and said that if she let him, he would not tell anyone about what had happened. The young lady suddenly remembered what had happened. She was in shock as she realized the full gravity of the crime. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she agreed. The young lady puzzledly said that she would take him. Sometime later, she showed him the training ground. She looked at the ground with surprise as everything seemed very strange to her, because now it was time for training, but there was no one. She looked at the platform and wondered why everything was like this. She thought that most likely they were all meeting His Majesty the Emperor. She looked at Theodore and asked if she could walk him to the meeting place. He smiled and said he wouldn't mind. The young lady looked at the emperor intently as she noticed that he had become even more handsome. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something was wrong. She turned around and said that everything was fine, and she was just wondering why the emperor wanted it. The emperor smiled and said that checking was also one of the emperor's duties. The young lady in turn knew that this was not the case, but she was also glad that he became a good emperor. Compared to her, he achieved heights. She knew that she was just a knight on the border, and just standing next to him was already a miracle for her. Sometime later, they entered the room. The emperor looked at the room in surprise and asked if she really lived here. The emperor noticed that the room was very shabby and miserable. The emperor asked how Lord Ferdinand felt about her. She sighed heavily and said that for her it was already too much as for a student. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really a knight's apprentice. Eva. That's exactly how it was. She knew it was Benjamin's suggestion, but she herself did not want to stand out among the knights. The emperor said with fury that he simply could not believe it. He grabbed the young lady by the hand. She looked at him in surprise. The emperor looked at her hand and said that Ferdinand's knights did not have the eyes to see her talent. The emperor kissed her hand tenderly and looked at the young lady. She was embarrassed and called him. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand why he suddenly did this. She wondered if he didn't see her as a man. The emperor smiled and said that thank God nothing had changed. Eva looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he had just said, but she felt like she was already losing consciousness. but a moment later, she was already in his arms. The emperor hugged her tightly. The emperor smiled and said that she was still alive. With tears in his eyes, he hugged her and said that now everything would be fine. He said with fury that he would take care of Ferdinand. The emperor laid the young lady on the bed. He tenderly said that he missed her very much, and at the same time, her true name. Theodore kissed her tenderly and said that she was his treasure and that he had never forgotten her in the last 10 years. On that fateful evening, he learned from his subordinate that her entire family had burned down and she had disappeared. At that moment, he felt as if his heart had stopped. It was very hard for him that it took a very long time, but in turn, he was very glad that he found her. Now he wanted to fix everything. A moment later, a servant entered the room and called the emperor. Lyndon looked at the emperor closely and asked if he had been here all this time. He said that everyone was worried when the emperor disappeared. Theodore looked at the knight with fury and told him to be quiet. Lyndon looked at the emperor in shock. He timidly asked for forgiveness. Looking at the bed, he saw a man, and judging by his clothes, he looked like a knight's apprentice. Lyndon looked at the emperor and said that Lady Katarina was waiting for him. And if he was late, it would be ugly. The operator said with a smile that there was no point in this anymore. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile on his face that he had already found what he was looking for. The knight looked at the emperor in surprise and asked if this was really it. The emperor did not let him finish and told him to be careful. The emperor looked sadly at the young lady and said that the curse of the dead still remained. He looked sideways at the knight and said that if he spoke her full name, there would be trouble. The knight sighed heavily and said that, as expected, from the fall of Cernicius, the Ferdinands had intervened. The emperor, thinking, said that it was all very strange. He did not understand what had caused the fall of Cernicius. He said that it must have been the plan of Margaret and Rudolf Ferdinand. The emperor, in turn, wondered who killed them and why Rudolf's curse did not disappear after his death, since he knew that the curse was still affecting Ivan. The emperor looked at his subordinate and said that he would like to give him an order. The knight said that he was listening to him. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and said that the knight was Ferdinand's apprentice and that a little investigation needed to be done about Eva Llewellyn. The young lady slept quietly, and at the same time, she dreamed of her family, who smiled at her and called her to them. She realized that it was just a dream, but she was still very happy. She was glad that she could see her family again and be in her grandmother's arms. But suddenly, she heard a familiar voice. She stepped back and saw the emperor. The emperor looked at her with interest and said with a smile that he was very glad to see her. A moment later, she woke up and sighed heavily. Wondering what this strange dream was looking around, she saw that she had fallen asleep in her room. She was confused and wondered how her dream had ended. A moment later, she realized that she had met the emperor in her dream. She realized that it was not a dream, and he was reality. With lightning speed, she got out of bed and ran because she wanted to see Theodore and make sure that it was not a dream. She ran at full speed because she wanted to find out where her friend was. Moments later, she didn't see Benjamin and accidentally tripped over him. He looked at her in surprise and asked her in confusion where she had been, as he had been looking for her everywhere. She asked for forgiveness in surprise and asked if he was looking for her urgently. He pulled her hand and said that now was not the time to go there. He told her to follow him, as it was better for her to hide for a while. She looked at him in confusion and asked what he was talking about. The young lady pulled away from his arms and said that it would only take a few minutes, and she would be right back. The young lady ran into the street in a hurry. Benjamin shouted at her not to run into the street. Running out into the street, the young lady froze in shock. Eva could not believe what she had just seen. She saw all the people who worked in the mansion kneeling in front of her friend, but she wondered if it was really her friend Theo. She saw the fire reflected in his eyes. Eva saw his fierce grin. She saw that he was looking at everyone present with a grin, and the young lady thought that this was the young tyrant Albrecht. Yvonne thought it was just stupid rumors like 10 years ago. But looking at Theodore, she thought that some of the rumors were true. The emperor turned and smiled at Yvonne and called her. She looked at Theodore in surprise at the way he called her Eve. The emperor said with a smile that she was just in time. He was glad to see her. The emperor looked at the young lady and asked if she would like to go with him. He said that he would like to take her into the Imperial Order of Knights. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise. She didn't expect him to say something like that. The emperor smiled and said that she was a very perceptive knight, and he believed that she would definitely be able to protect him. The young lady stared at her friend. She was amazed and could not utter a word. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she was Ferdinand. But a few minutes later, Benjamin stood before the young lady and told the emperor that this would be a lot of trouble. The emperor looked at the young man with fury, as he really wanted to take his girlfriend. A moment later, the emperor looked at Mr. Benjamin with a smile and said that he understood everything. The emperor looked at the young man intently and asked him if he understood correctly that he was Ferdinand's chief. A moment later, Benjamin knelt before the emperor. Barely containing his rage, he said that he was the head of Ferdinand, and they greeted Emperor Albrecht. The emperor in turn watched with a grin as Benjamin knelt before him. Benjamin looked at the emperor with a deep gaze and said that Eva Llewellyn was Ferdinand's knight, and no matter how great the emperor was, he would not be able to take her away. The emperor looked at him in bewilderment and asked if she had not been knighted. The emperor was perplexed and did not understand where the problems came from then. The emperor looked at them intently and said that he had asked Sir Llewellyn's permission. All present looked at the emperor in bewilderment. Benjamin turned to the young lady and asked if it was true. The young lady shook her head in denial. Benjamin looked at the emperor and said that he joked too often. The emperor said with a grin that in that case he would issue an imperial decree. Benjamin Cheese said with fury that it was impossible even for the emperor to do this. The emperor looked at the young man with disdain and asked what the matter of payment was. A moment later, a young lady came out to them and said with a smirk that if that was the case, then he should discuss it with her. The young lady greeted the emperor with a grin and introduced herself. The emperor looked at her with an angry look and said that this matter did not concern her. The young lady smiled and said that it was not so. Katarina looked at the emperor with a grin and said that she was very sorry, but Eva was given to her as a gift by Rudolph. Katarina said with a grin that she was Eva's direct mistress, and she was her most precious gift. The emperor was shocked by what he heard. He was overcome with unheard-of rage. A moment later, the emperor looked at everyone present with a grin and said that in that case they could do it. The young lady was very happy, and in an instant she looked at the emperor with a smile. She said that he could give her the title of empress, but before she could finish speaking, the emperor struck her. Everyone present froze in shock as they did not expect to see something like this. Emperor Shi looked with anger at the young lady who was sitting on the ground and bleeding as if he didn't have a word. The emperor came closer to the young lady and said with fury that in exchange for Eve, he would spare her life. A moment later, the emperor said with a sweet smile that the price would be life. He said that this was already clear before. The young lady looked at her friend in shock as she did not expect to see such a thing. Katarina, in turn, sitting on the ground, trembled with fear. She realized that this man was very dangerous. Now she realized that he would, without hesitation, really kill her on the spot. Trembling with fear, she asked him for help. She said that she would give him Eva Llewellyn. The young lady slowly reached for the documents. She was trembling with fear, as she was afraid of losing her life. Yvonne, in turn, looked at Katarina, who was holding the document of the mistress, and the servant dumbfounded. Yvonne wondered if she always carried it with her. A moment later, the emperor easily tore up the document and said with a smile that now there were no obstacles. He looked at our friend and said with a smile that she would never be his slave. He came closer to her and asked with a smile if she would go with him. The young lady, in turn, was very glad that he helped her. She dreamed of being with him again. She smiled and said that she would go. But a moment later, she heard Benjamin's voice behind her calling her. Turning around, she saw his depressed look. Benjamin came closer to her, and taking her hand, told her not to go. Without raising his eyes to the young lady, he said that he begged her very much for this. She looked at him intently, as she felt very sorry for him, but still asked for forgiveness. A moment later, her face changed, and she told him that she wanted to follow His Majesty. Turning her back to him, she thanked him with a smile for everything she knew, that even if the theater had been her only light in the darkness during those hellish days, the young lady slowly found herself side by side with the emperor, feeling awkward. The emperor turned and looked at the young lady with a tender smile. He said that he was very glad that she had chosen him. He smiled and said that he thought he would have to take her by force if she refused. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she said that it was her mistake, and she didn't know that he would walk there alone. She said that she would never harm him. The emperor looked at the young lady with a smile. A moment later, he came up to her and hugged her tightly. The young lady was surprised and stunned by this action, and was also very embarrassed. The emperor looked into her beautiful eyes and said with a smile that he liked her. As soon as he saw her, Theodore asked if he could call her by name. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew that she had lived under a different name for 10 years, and now she felt very awkward hugging him. She felt that the smell that came from him had not changed. For a moment, she felt as if she had gone back in time. Benjamin was sleeping, and he dreamed of Eva. He begged her not to leave and stay with him, but she hid him with a smile and asking for forgiveness left. As she left, she said that she would go with His Majesty. She thanked him for everything he had done for her. The maids were in shock. They shouted at the young lady to come to her senses. They shouted for someone to call a doctor immediately. A moment later, the doctor came running and saw Katarina, who was lying on the ground, covered in blood. He also saw the young gentleman, who was furious. The doctor had a feeling that the young gentleman was about to explode with rage and anger. But Benjamin, in turn, quietly said that he would not leave everything so easily. He could not just allow her to be taken away like that. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked if something was wrong. The young lady was taken aback and thanked the emperor for his concern. Theodore smiled and told her that she shouldn't be so nervous and that she could relax. She was in shock and didn't know if it would help since she was uncomfortable. She was in shock. She knew that she was not even a knight yet and wondered if she could ride in a carriage like this with the emperor. Theodore sighed heavily and asked if she was afraid of him. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, sighed heavily, and said that nothing could be done about it, since she had to see a not very pleasant scene. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. She remembered how he towered over the young lady at his feet and begged for mercy. She wondered if he really thought that he could scare her with that. She looked at the emperor and said that it was not like that at all, and she was not afraid of him. Rather, at that moment, she felt relief.
Yvonne was very happy because she was finally free from a long tyranny.
The emperor looked at the young lady and tenderly called her. He touched her earlier on the cheek. A moment later, a bright light illuminated her. She was surprised as she noticed that her wound was completely healed. The emperor smiled and told her not to worry anymore, as he would protect her from now on. The young lady sighed heavily, and looking away from the emperor, said that it was she who should protect him. Theodore smiled and said that it was exactly like that. He wanted to feel her care and affection. He came even closer to her and asked with a smile if she would comfort him. And the young lady was confused. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was saying. She saw that her hands were shaking. Theodore asked with a smile, "Isn't it funny he said that the great emperor is afraid of blood?" The lady was shocked because she realized that he had deliberately portrayed cruelty and tyranny in front of her, and it was all for her sake. The young lady gently took the emperor's hand. She said that if he was against it, he could push her away. Theodore smiled and said that he was very glad that she was next to him. After several days of travel, they finally arrived at the imperial palace. The road was smooth, but the initiation ceremony was delayed due to a lot of work. At the same time, the young lady became a close friend of the emperor. Yvonne was able to successfully join the Order of Knights. She was incredibly happy about it. But the atmosphere inside the Knights' joint was different. The Knights looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was Eva Lolin. The young lady tensed up for a moment, as the atmosphere was not pleasant. But after a while, everything changed, as the Knights treated her very friendly. The lady in turn thought that they would treat her with distrust and would be angry that a newcomer had joined them. But everything was different. For young Yvonne, those 10 years were the most terrible in her life. But now for her, a time of peace has come. The emperor smiled and said that if she stood for a long time, her legs would go numb. She smiled and said that everything was fine. The young lady in turn saw the emperor's gaze on her, and she had some concerns about this. The emperor took the young lady by the hand and said that he did not like this, and that she should come to him. He smiled and told her to sit back and have some dessert. The young lady was surprised. She said that she had to protect him. The emperor smiled and said that everything was fine now. He said with a sly smile that there was no point in just standing there now. Theodore said that there were other people who accompanied him. He looked at his subordinate and asked if that was true. The young man, trembling with fear, said that everything was exactly like that. He wanted to leave them as soon as possible. The young lady thought for a moment as she saw that the people were still afraid of the emperor, but she still knew that this was very strange. She saw that he was being very kind to her, but at the same time, others were very afraid of him. She did not understand why everything was suddenly like this. The emperor looked at the young men and said with a smile that the minister's insight was amazing and he would like to reward him personally. Theodore asked why they didn't take a break from their work. He saw that even the officials were afraid of him. The emperor in turn praised the chef and said that his dessert was a very good job, but the chef trembled with fear and asked for forgiveness. She saw that he was very kind to the workers of the imperial palace and caring for everyone. The emperor looked at all the knights present and said that from now on there was no longer a need to accompany him, so they could just go back to their place. After dinner, the knights were at a loss. The emperor said with a satisfied smile that they did not need to worry about him, as he had an excellent assistant. Everyone was notified and wondered what really happened to the emperor. The young lady was lost in her thoughts. She didn't understand why he had changed so much, but she still knew that it was influenced by the fact that he became the emperor of the country while she was eating dessert. She didn't notice how dirty she got. Theodore called his friend with a smile and wiped the cream off her face. He smiled slyly and said that the dessert was very tasty. Everyone present was shocked by the emperor's behavior, and the young lady looked at him with embarrassment. A moment later, the assistant called out and asked for forgiveness, saying he needed to step out for a minute. The young lady was surprised and shocked. She couldn't believe that he behaved like this. The emperor looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had finally become quiet. A moment later, he dropped down and lay on her lap. Yvonne was surprised as she did not expect this. She called the emperor. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he just needed to rest a little, as there was a lot of work today. In recent days, she had one concern. The emperor looked at the young lady and with a smile told her to play with him. Yvonne, in turn, was confused by such words of her friend. She was in shock and wondered what she should do when the emperor behaved so stupidly. The young lady, after asking for forgiveness, asked the emperor if he needed to get up. Now he sighed heavily and said that he would like to rest a little more. Yvonne, in turn, looked at the table on which there were many papers. She knew that he had a lot of work accumulated. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't know what to do in this situation. The emperor smiled and said that they could play some more. She looked at him hard, not approvingly, and wondered if he had always been like this. Without looking at the emperor, she asked him if he really treated everyone like that. The emperor asked in bewilderment if she didn't like what he was doing, and the young lady was taken aback and said that it was not so. He looked at her and, sighing heavily, said that she accepted him as he was. The emperor slowly reached out to her. He looked at her intently. The emperor quietly said that everyone was afraid of him. He really wanted someone to comfort him. The young lady noticed that his hands were shaking again. Yvonne looked at her friend with a smile and told him not to worry. The young lady took his hand tenderly and said that she would always be by his side. Theodore was confused by her words and stood frozen in shock. But a moment later, he came even closer to her. She looked at him in bewilderment and called out. Theodore couldn't stand it and threw her on the sofa. The lady looked at him in surprise. Theodore smiled and asked what she was thinking about now. He was interested in her thoughts. Yvonne looked at him, dumbfounded, and said that she had no thoughts at the moment. Theodore took her hand tenderly and, sighing heavily, said that it was very disappointing. He smiled and said that he wanted her to think about him. He kissed her hand tenderly and said that all he thought about right now was her. Theodore looked at the young lady intently and said that she was the most beautiful person he had ever met in his life. The young lady looked at him shyly. She felt like her heart was about to explode. A moment later, she pushed him away and asked, puzzled, what he was even talking about. She said timidly that the word beautiful made her happy, but she herself knew that she looked like a man. Theodore took her hand and, pulling her closer to him, said that this was not so. She looked at him intently, as it was the first time she met such a beautiful and handsome man. The emperor pulled the young lady closer to him and called out. He slowly reached out to kiss her. But a moment later, the young lady broke free from his embrace and hurried to the exit. She embarrassedly asked for forgiveness. The emperor looked after her with bewilderment. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she needed to step out for a while. Theodore stared after her, and as he did so, he called out to her and told her real name. The young lady, in turn, was perplexed. She did not know what to do now. Since her heart did not stop beating loudly, she could not believe that her friend did something like that. A moment later, the knights approached her and looked at her with bewilderment. They were surprised since her condition was not good. They asked with bewilderment if she was okay. One of the knights asked if something had happened. The question about the young lady remembered what had happened. She froze in place in embarrassment. The knight asked in bewilderment why she had blushed so much. Yvonne shouted that nothing had happened at all. The knight looked at her in bewilderment and asked if the emperor had really offended her. The knight looked at the young lady closely and said that she could tell them the truth since their emperor was often rude to them and was sometimes cruel. The young lady, gritting her teeth, looked at the knight. A moment later, she shouted that His Majesty did not have such a man and told them not to say such nonsense. The knights froze in place in surprise. They looked in shock at the young lady who was running away. In a hurry, they called her. But she said that she would go away for a while. Yvonne was walking late at night. She saw that the imperial palace she had visited many years ago had not changed at all, and being next to the emperor suddenly brought back childhood memories. Yvonne remembered their time together when they were cheerful and carefree. Although she tried to deny it, her heart wanted him. She thought that perhaps this meant that she loved the emperor very much, but she knew that this could not be allowed, and now was not the time for it. She knew that she had a lot of work to do now, because she wanted to know the fate of her family, to finally clear the name of her dead family. She knew that everything had to be just like this. She understood that, because of unnecessary feelings, she would not be able to do anything. She was very angry with herself because of this, but a moment later, she threw all her thoughts away as she heard some noise near her. Yvonne looked in the direction from which the noise came and asked with fury who was there. A moment later, a young man came out from behind a tree and, asking for forgiveness, said that he did not want to scare her at all. Yvonne froze in bewilderment because she saw the second Prince Ernst in front of her. She could not believe her eyes. The young lady froze in place and did not say a word. She did not expect to see her childhood friend at such a moment. The young lady remembered that terrible moment when, after the death of her family, he found her, and with tears in his eyes said that he would protect her from now on. She was furious because he said he would come for her and said he would protect her. She was furious because she was so stupid then to believe him. The young lady imagined a sword at her friend's throat. He looked at her with bewilderment and told her to wait a little. She looked at him with fury and told him to be careful. Yvonne, if he dared to call her name, he would die immediately. The prince looked at his friend with tears in his eyes. He looked down at the floor and cried, and asked his girlfriend for forgiveness. He said that he couldn't keep the promise he made to her. He said that he was very sorry. She sighed heavily and said that he still cried like a child. The young lady slowly put away her sword, but the prince did not answer. She sighed heavily and said that Yvonne was no more. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that she was Eva Llewellyn. The young man looked at her in bewilderment. Yvonne smiled and said that this was her name. Now the prince looked at her in bewilderment, but did not answer. After this incident, the prince cried a lot and apologized to the young lady, and after he was able to calm down, she heard his stories. The prince tried to meet her several times, but unfortunately, the Empress and Rudolph did not allow him to do so. The prince said with bitter regret that all this time he was thinking about her. Ernst promised to meet her on condition of Katarina's engagement. The prince said that suddenly, Uncle Rudolph and his mother went somewhere, and no engagement took place. She understood that after that there was no need to say anything. Then her friend lost his support, and none other than Theodore himself became emperor. Yvonne understood that even if her friend did not want the throne, his mere presence was controlling. He sighed heavily and asked her for forgiveness. Again, the young lady looked away from him and said that everything was fine, and she was already finished. She looked at him with a smile and asked how he recognized her, since she had changed so much in appearance. The prince smiled and said that, of course it was so, but still, he said with a soft smile that he would always and everywhere recognize her. The young lady froze in place. She was amazed. She sighed heavily as she only now realized that she could not recognize the real Theodore. A moment later, the emperor came up to them and said that he had been very worried and wondered where she could have disappeared to. Emperor Theodore looked at her with fury and said that he had finally found her. He glared at them and said that it looked like they were flirting during her working hours. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and told her to follow him. Ernst looked at his brother and said puzzledly that it was not like that at all. The prince stared after them as he could do nothing else. The emperor, in turn, furiously shook the hand of the young lady and led her behind him. Yvonne called out to the emperor, but he did not answer. She closed her eyes for a moment, as it was very painful for her, from the fact that he was squeezing her hand tightly. Without looking back, he asked angrily if she had really been with Ernst at such a time. He said with anger in his voice that they were chatting very nicely. The young lady was in shock, as if she had just been slapped. She felt like she had been doused with hot water. She did not understand why her heart was ready to burst now. A moment later, having settled down, she asked his forgiveness for leaving without warning him, and she asked in bewilderment why he was so angry. She didn't understand his feelings, because she knew he didn't even remember her name. The emperor looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked if she was asking now, because she didn't know it. The emperor shouted angrily that it was natural that he was angry, since the man he liked was now having a nice conversation with another guy. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and burst into tears, wondering if it was Eva he really liked. She was very sad and hurt. Theodore came closer to her and told her not to cry. He hugged her tenderly and, asking for forgiveness, said that he did not want her to cry and that he had no intention of frightening her. The young lady realized that he remained as kind and sweet as before. She hugged him tightly and said that she loved him very much. The emperor pushed her away in embarrassment and looked intently into her eyes. He asked her if she loved him. The young lady kept crying. Yvonne looked into the distance as she realized she had made a mistake. The emperor hugged her tightly and told her to answer him. Yvonne hugged Theodore tenderly and told him that she loved him. The young lady looked the emperor in the eye and said that she loved him very much. A moment later, they were locked in a passionate kiss, giving in to the feelings they had long hidden. The young lady pulled away from Theodore and, sighing heavily, asked him to wait a little. Yvonne looked the emperor straight in the eye and said that she really wanted to tell him something. The emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that nothing bothered him. Now she looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled softly and said she was a woman, and Yvonne's name also remained in his memory. The young lady recoiled and said that he could not do, that she said that if he said her name, it would be very bad. He looked at her and said with a smile that he loved her. The young lady screamed and called him with rage. She wanted him to stop and not make this mistake. A moment later, the emperor said her full name out loud. The young lady, in turn, knew that there are memories that cannot be forgotten. After so much time, she was slowly going about her business, when suddenly someone called her. Turning around, she saw her mother calling her the madame, smiled, and told her daughter to come to her. She gave her some cookies with a smile Yvonne was happy with, such a gift from her mother. Her mother looked at her with a smile and asked for forgiveness, saying that sometimes she causes her trouble. She remembered the day when her mother first gave her sweets. She remembered the day her precious family disappeared from the face of the earth. All her memories came flooding back when she heard her full name. She closed her eyes and screamed, but a moment later, opening her eyes, she realized that nothing had happened. She looked at Theodore in surprise and asked how he managed to do it. He smiled a gentle smile and took her hand, said that he had said earlier that he would protect her from now on. He said that all of Ferdinand's magic had disappeared. The young lady looked at her lover with tears in her eyes. He smiled and asked if he could love her now. She knew that she would never forget this day. The young lady slept quietly and peacefully in bed. She was very happy. She woke up and slowly sat up on the bed, looking around. She wondered where she was now. She noticed that the room was very beautiful. She was puzzled because she could not remember anything, but a moment later she realized where she was. Theodore smiled and, looking at his beloved, asked if she was awake. Yet she looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was doing here. Theodore slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that this was his room. He asked if she was not fully awake yet. Yvonne was in shock. She did not understand why she was now in the emperor's room. He smiled and asked if she was feeling unwell. He touched her face sheepishly and said that it seemed like he had really stressed her out yesterday. The young lady was shocked. His words made her embarrassed, and she screamed. She froze in bewilderment and did not know what to answer at the same time. The emperor chuckled quietly. He smiled and told her not to worry because nothing had happened. A moment later, Theodore looked at her and called her name with a smile. The young lady now realizing that he had called her by her real name yesterday. She looked at him intently, still not understanding why nothing had happened. Theodore smiled and said that it would turn out that she had a lot of questions. He tenderly threw a robe over her and told her not to worry, as he would answer any question she had. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that a lot had changed in the last 10 years. He still missed her very much. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked how he knew her, namely, how he knew her real identity. Theodore smiled and said that of course he knew it. From the moment he saw her, he understood everything. He smiled and said that he was not so stupid as not to recognize the woman he loved. Yvonne looked closely at the emperor. She was embarrassed by his words. She was very pleased with his words. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he pretended not to recognize her. He said with a smile that at that moment it seemed to him that she didn't really want him to get to know her. The emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that he did not want to tell her about it so soon. But she looked at him in such a way that he simply could not continue to hide everything any longer. The young lady was shocked by his words and choked on her tea. She wondered if that was really how it was. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened to the spell that was on her. She wondered if he had removed it. Theodore smiled and said that it was all divine power. The young lady looked at Theodore in bewilderment, as she did not understand what divine power was being talked about. A moment later, the emperor broke the cup and showed her his hand, saying that divine power could heal anything. She saw a bright light surround him. He said that divine power could heal a scar or a curse. He smiled and said that he had healed the scar on her hand. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She looked at her hands and noticed that they were clean and beautiful. The emperor smiled and said that he had trained hard so that he could somehow heal her when they met. He smiled a gentle smile and said that he never believed that she was dead. The young lady looked at the emperor intently. She was confused by such words. Now she realized that their meeting was not accidental. She realized that all these years he continued to look for her. She did not know what to do, as she was very glad that she learned this information. She smiled a soft smile and thanked him for everything. Theodore looked at her in surprise and asked how long she would treat him with respect, and the young lady looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. A moment later, she said that she was already used to it, since she should not behave like that in front of other people. He came closer to her and told her to call him by his name. Theodore touched his beloved and with a smile told her to call him Theo. She looked at him with embarrassment, since she could not say such a thing. But without letting her finish, the emperor kissed her passionately. Theodore smiled and said that it was perfectly normal for them to address each other that way. Yvonne was shocked because it all happened so quickly, but she was still very happy about it, looked at him with a sweet smile, and still agreed. A moment later, the emperor tenderly kissed his beloved, and she reciprocated. Benjamin, in turn, furiously smashed the magic ball he saw his beloved kissing the emperor. He was furious and didn't understand how this could have happened. Moments later, Benjamin stared at the ball that lay next to him, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't believe that she had betrayed him. The young man, in turn, slowly walked along the corridors of the imperial castle. He was glad since everything in the castle was very quiet. A moment later, he heard the laughter and hubbub of the maids. He knew that recently there had been a scandal in the imperial palace between His Highness and his close knight. He knew that his mouth was unclear about the knight who had betrayed the emperor. The knight became a favorite among all the people in the palace, and the maids said that they saw them together leaving the emperor's bedroom. The young man, in turn, knew that it made no difference to him who His Majesty slept with. The main thing was that it would in no way affect the others. He knew that the only thing that mattered was that they would definitely not cut off his head now. A moment later, he knocked on the emperor's door. He knew that he could work safely, for now. He entered the office and said that he had brought him the materials. A moment later, he saw a very inappropriate picture. The young lady in turn screamed. The young man froze in bewilderment from shock. He didn't know what to do now. The young lady screamed at the emperor and asked what the knights would think of her now. The emperor in turn understood that if his subordinate wanted to live, he would not talk about anything. The emperor sighed heavily and said that she must already know everything. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. Theodore smiled, looking at his beloved, and said that rumors were already circulating around the court about an affair with His Majesty. Theodore smiled and said that she must not know that she was the one behind these rumors. The young lady froze in shock. She timidly said that he could not have not known about it because the knights were in confusion. She remembered how the knights looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she really was a woman. She sighed heavily and said that she had to go through a lot of troubles. He looked at her and said with a smile that when the curse was lifted, the magic that kept her in chains disappeared. He knew it was some trick that made her look like a man. The emperor said that he had taken care of this in advance, so that now everyone should know who she belonged to. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he had just said. A moment later, he pulled her closer to him and said that they needed to restore their relationship first. The young lady looked at the table and saw that he had a lot of work. She asked if he was tired. He sighed heavily and said that he was not very tired. The young lady in turn understood that he was lying to her. She remembered how she woke up at night, but he was not there as he was completely focused on work. Theodore sighed heavily and said that he was busy, that he didn't even go to bed. He smiled and said that time for sleep was a waste of time, because now he wanted to be with her and restore their long-lost and fallen-out-of life 10 years. Yvonne was taken aback and looked at her lover with embarrassment. Moments later, the emperor kissed Yvonne tenderly. A moment later, he pulled back with a smile and said that he had something he wanted to give her. The emperor smiled and put a beautiful hairpin on her hair. She looked at him in bewilderment. Theodore smiled and said it was in memory of his late mother, and his mother had written a book about royal marriages. Theodore said that he was now preparing to bring up the topic of the Cruelty family again. The young lady looked at him with bewilderment. He said that although it might take some time, he wanted her to be his wife when the time came. The young lady looked at him in shock, but a moment later she hugged him tightly. The emperor smiled as he hugged his beloved and asked, "How about Togo growing his hair again?" He said that they were still beautiful now, but if they grew longer, they would be even more beautiful. She smiled and agreed with him. She was very happy in his arms, and next to him, she could not even express her happiness in words. Before she was always afraid, because misfortunes haunted her at every step. The young lady stood and quietly looked at the imperial castle, but suddenly she heard someone calling her. Ernst smiled, looking at his friend, and asked how long she had been waiting, asking for forgiveness for his being late. She smiled and said that she had just arrived. From that day on, they continued to meet periodically. The young man looked back and asked how about his brother. The young lady smiled and told her friend not to worry as the emperor was currently at work. Their meetings were of course secret. The prince looked at his friend and said that he heard that the emperor again wanted to raise the topic of the Cernisi family. The young lady looked away in embarrassment and said that His Majesty the Emperor was trying his best. She knew that her family's business was not an easy one, but she knew that one thing was clear. They had been falsely accused. And since the accusations were of treason, the sharp reaction was immediate. The emperor looked closely at his beloved and asked for forgiveness. The young lady in turn knew that he deliberately did not show her his feelings. For this reason, she simply had to stand and wait on the side. The prince looked closely at his friend, who was sad he did not know what to say to her. But a moment later, he stopped and told her to wait. She looked at him in bewilderment. The prince said that he needed to tell her something. He said he wasn't sure whether to tell her or not, but he decided to anyway. He looked at her closely and said he still thought she should know. He said that there was a possibility that one member of the Cernisi family was alive. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She asked questions about who it could be. She wanted to find him right now. The emperor looked at his beloved and called out, but she did not answer, so he came closer to her and called out again. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what had happened as he saw that she had turned completely pale. The young lady looked at the emperor intently, but did not respond as she was lost in her thoughts. But a moment later, she said that she was fine. She understood that Theodore was in a difficult situation now because of her family, and she did not want to bother him with something like that. Theodore looked at her intently, but did not answer. He saw that something was gnawing at her, but a moment later, the emperor looked with an evil gaze at the other knights. They froze in shock as they were afraid of such a gaze from the emperor. A moment later, he was taken aback and told that they had urgent work to do. Having asked for forgiveness, they said that it was time for them to go, and the young lady looked after them in bewilderment. Theodore looked at her intently and told her to tell him immediately what had happened. He looked at her sadly and asked what was troubling her, as he was very worried about her. Sometime later, they went to a secluded place, and she told him everything. The emperor smiled and told her not to worry too much, as he would definitely find it. Moments later, the young lady's expression changed, and she looked at the emperor with a smile. He looked at her puzzled and said that he asked her to call him by his name when they were alone. Yvonne thanked him with a satisfied smile, calling him Theo. Theodore looked at the young lady intently. He was very confused by her beautiful smile. A moment later, the emperor came closer to her. She looked at him in bewilderment and called out. Theodore, in turn, hugged the young lady tightly. She was embarrassed by such behavior. The young lady was perplexed why he was suddenly behaving like this. The emperor, breathing heavily, said that since Rudolph's curse had worn off, men looked at her differently. The young lady said, puzzled, that she hadn't even noticed it. And Theodore said, puzzled, that she should set personal boundaries. She asked in surprise if he was really telling her about this. She said that she had only thought about it for a moment. He had already torn her away from her work. Theodore sighed heavily, since he was not talking about that at all. The emperor was very upset and angry, as everyone saw that his beloved was beautiful. Yvonne sighed heavily and said that she needed to work. This infuriated Theodore, as he suddenly remembered Benjamin looking at her. He wondered how Benjamin dared to desire his beloved. Benjamin, in turn, wrote a letter to the great emperor. He wrote that he had discovered something strange connected with the Ferdinand family and asked for his permission to come to the palace to tell about everything in more detail. The emperor knew that he needed to make sure that the young lady was not in danger. The young lady stood frozen in place in bewilderment. A moment later, she called out to Theodore in embarrassment as he first kissed her tenderly and then bit her. The young lady looked at her lover in bewilderment. She did not understand why he was behaving so strangely. But a moment later, the emperor came to the wall and kissed the young lady tenderly. Their passionate kiss lasted a long time. Theodore knew that Yvonne belonged to him, and he did not want to give her to anyone. When the young lady woke up, she noticed that she was not feeling very well. A moment later, she sneezed. Theodore came closer to her and asked how she was feeling. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she already felt better than before. Theodore looked at her puzzledly and said that it looked like she still had a fever. Yvonne looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked why he had not fallen ill. Theodore was taken aback, as he did not think that she would ask something like that. He smiled and said he didn't even know Theodore asked if it could be. Because she was hugging him so hotly, Yvonne looked at him confused. He smiled and apologized, saying he got carried away. Theodore came closer to her, and with a grin said that he wanted to be outside with her more often when it got warmer. Yvonne blushed all over with embarrassment. A moment later, she pushed him away and told him to get going, as he had a lot of work to do. Theodore laughed, as he found it fun to tease her. Covering her, he asked with a smile. If she could cope alone, she looked intently at her lover and said that of course she could cope since she was no longer a child. She looked after him with sadness and longing, because she knew that he himself always worked at night and was very tired. Theodore looked at her closely and said that if she got worse, she should take medicine. Theodore dressed slowly. He sighed heavily and said that he would leave a few servants outside the door, and if she needed anything, she could call them. The young lady in turn agreed, but a moment later she pulled at his clothes. Theodore looked at her in surprise. The young lady realized what she had done to her, timidly let him go. She asked for forgiveness as unconsciously, but established Theodore. The emperor approached her with a smile and kissed her on the forehead, and said that he would return soon and that she should rest. He smiled and said that he loved her. She looked after him intently, but a moment later, she lay down alone. She was pleased that the emperor expressed his love with actions. Yvonne liked his soft voice, but she was puzzled by the fact that each time she did not have time to answer him in kind. The knight looked at the emperor and said in a hurry that he was too tired and that they had all better stop. The emperor sighed heavily and said that there was no need for this and that he needed to hurry. But a moment later, the emperor's horse went berserk. The young lady woke up and noticed that it was snowing outside the window. She looked out the window with a smile because she knew that when he returned, she would be the first to tell him how she felt. The knight rushed hastily towards the emperor. They shouted, but he did not answer. The emperor, in turn, fell to the ground in an unconscious state and covered the ground with his blood. Yvonne ran to her beloved. In a hurry, she was very worried as she was told the sad news. The knights, in turn, were on duty near the emperor's room. They were very worried. A moment later, some looked in surprise at the young lady who was running towards the emperor as fast as she could. Yvonne looked at the knights present with fear and confusion. She said that she had been informed that something had happened to His Majesty. The knights came closer to her and told her to calm down, as the emperor was fine. They sighed heavily and said that it was better for her not to disturb him now. The knight looked at her and said that she herself looked bad, and that it would be better for her to go and rest. But Yvonne did not listen to anything, and pushing them away, ran to the emperor's room. The young lady burst into the emperor's room and froze in the doorway. She saw him in pain, but a moment later he looked at her with contempt and malice. She smiled and said that she was very glad that he was safe. But before she could finish speaking, a cup suddenly flew at her and smashed against the wall with a crash. The young lady froze in place. She did not understand what was happening. The emperor looked at her with fury. She looked at him in bewilderment, frozen in shock. She felt warm blood running down her cheek. The emperor, in his rage, shouted and ordered her to be quiet, as his head was about to explode. He shouted for her to stop looking at him and get away. The emperor looked at everyone present with anger and asked what was the matter. He angrily asked if she had never seen anyone wounded. The young lady stood there in bewilderment. She did not understand what was going on at all. The emperor shouted in rage and told her to be taken out of his sight. The emperor's assistant approached her and told her to come out. The young lady looked closely at her lover, wondering if it was really him. She was shocked because she knew he hadn't behaved like that before she saw his gaze, which was filled with anger and rage. The doctor looked at the emperor and asked if he was feeling better. The emperor said angrily that his head was hurting very badly. He ordered the doctor to bring more medicine. The emperor looked at the doctor with anger and asked why he froze in place. The doctor ran and said that he would do everything now. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he had not seen him in such a state for a long time. The emperor looked at the doctor in bewilderment and asked him angrily what he was saying. A moment later, he looked out the window in bewilderment and asked why it was snowing in the middle of summer. The young lady looked at the assistant in bewilderment and asked if the emperor had lost his memory. She was shocked because she did not expect to hear such a thing. The assistant looked at her and said that everything was exactly like that, and the emperor had forgotten the last 6 months from the moment of his visit to the Ferdinands until today. Yvonne was shocked because she realized that all the memories he had about her, he had forgotten. The emperor looked at everyone present in bewilderment and asked if he had really fallen off his horse. He was in shock. His head was splitting with pain. He said that this simply could not happen. The emperor said in a furious voice that someone had knocked him down. He said that it was exactly like that, and he saw blinding sunlight. His mind was clouded, and he did not remember the face he had missed for so long. Sighing heavily, he said that he seemed to have seen it somewhere before. The assistant looked at the young lady and said with sadness in his voice that she should not despair. The man said that he, in fact, the emperor had always been like this. Yvonne looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her and said that he had one request. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her not to leave the emperor alone. Yvonne froze in place in shock. She was surprised as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said with a gentle smile that she was the only person the emperor allowed to get close to him. The assistant said that since she appeared, the emperor had become softer, and he had never seen him like this before. The assistant said that he suddenly told His Majesty that he wanted another bodyguard. He told the young lady to be careful, as he might decide to throw her out. He said that it could end up in much more serious injuries. The young lady touched her cheek, where there was a cut. Yvonne, in turn, wondered if Theo had forgotten her. She was in shock and could not believe it. The young lady knew that she would not leave it that easily, as they had already been through a lot. Yvonne came to the emperor the next day. She sighed heavily in front of the closed door, but having gained strength, she still decided to go in. She saw the commotion that was around the emperor. The young lady box greeted the emperor. Yvonne looked at the emperor intently and said that she had returned to service after an illness. The emperor looked at his assistant with anger and said that he had ordered another guard to be found for him. The man sighed heavily, looking away, and said that it was not such a simple matter. The emperor looked at the young lady and told his assistant to try to finish it quickly. From the way he spoke and the way he spoke, she realized that he really didn't recognize her, and Yvonne knew that there was nothing wrong with that. The young lady who called the queue knew that what was forgotten could be remembered. She knew she was always the one he loved, and she wanted to prove it. Now the young lady wanted to prove and show how much she loved him. The emperor's assistant looked at everyone present a moment later. He looked at the emperor and called out in surprise. The emperor in turn slowly approached the young lady. Yvonne froze in place. She stared at Theodore without looking away. She remembered the assistant's words, telling her to be careful, because if he decided to throw her out, it could end in much more serious injuries. The emperor raised his big palm. The young lady frowned and closed her eyes because she thought that he wanted to hit her. Theodore looked at her and said that she still had a fever. He asked how she even thought of coming here. A moment later, he grabbed her by the scruff of the neck and threw her out the door. He looked at her with fury and told her to come back when she was completely cured. The emperor looked angrily at the young lady who was sitting on the ground and said that most likely her place would already be taken by then. The young lady was shocked, as she knew that his speech was a group, but he was still her kind. Theodore, she knew that she could be patient for a little while, and everything would fall into place. 2 days later, the young lady saw the assistant and asked if he had found a new bodyguard. She was in shock. She couldn't believe it. The man looked at her puzzled and asked if she was okay. The young lady sighed heavily and, trembling from the inevitable, asked what would happen to her. Now she knew that nothing good would come of this situation. The assistant smiled and told her not to worry and to consider it an extra vacation. The knight sat on the ground and trembled with fear. He was in shock because he did not expect that there would be a sword in front of him. The knight screamed and begged for forgiveness from the emperor. The assistant sighed heavily as he realized that the new knight had not even lasted 2 days in his post. The emperor screamed furiously for this trash to be removed from his sight. Immediately, the knight screamed and begged for forgiveness, but no one listened to him. The assistant looked closely at the emperor and asked if he really needed to find a new person again. The emperor looked at him with fury and asked what he said. Theodore was irritated by the knight's incompetence and could not work with them. The assistant said that simply no one could cope with Lady Eve, since she was young, agile, and responsible. The assistant said that the emperor himself had brought her here. The emperor looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about, since he did not remember ever bringing her to the palace. The man said that everything was exactly like that, and 6 months ago the emperor personally took her from the Ferdinand estate. The emperor thought for a moment and asked where Lyndon was. Now the man said that he had sent him on a mission on a secret matter a few times, and to be honest, even he himself did not know the details of this matter. The emperor frowned for a moment and thought he knew that the Ferdinand estate was the last place Yvonne had been seen. He remembered going there under the pretext of an engagement to try to find Yvonne. He sighed heavily because he knew that this was where his memories ended. The emperor looked at his assistant and said that he needed to write a letter. The emperor said angrily that he wanted to talk to Ferdinand, and he needed him to come to the castle immediately. A whole week passed after the emperor's injury. Yvonne recovered and returned to her post. To be honest, there were many people who tried to get her position, but unfortunately, they couldn't last even a day. The young lady sighed heavily as she now understood why everything was so difficult. She was shocked because she realized that the emperor was now getting irritated even from breathing too loudly. He was always cursing at her, and she wondered how the aristocrats could tolerate him if even she suffered so much from him. The young lady looked at the emperor intently. She knew that she could handle such a task. She became that deep down. He still loved her, but still she was upset. Yes, but the situation, the young lady in turn wondered how to return his memory. She sincerely wanted to bring back all their memories. The young lady looked at the emperor intently, and then she thought that it could work. Sometime later, she made up her mind and called him. She said that she had something to tell him. She knew that he might not remember these 6 months completely, but she still had to try to do at least something. She looked at him and asked him to give her some attention and his time. Ivan knew that he had to understand that she was the true Ivan. The emperor looked at the knights and said that somewhere a puppy was barking. He turned around and left, not wanting to talk to her. A moment later, the young lady finally grabbed him by the clothes and insistently said that it was very important. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and noticed that she was very strange. Theodore did not understand why she stubbornly tolerated such terrible treatment. He knew he could just shake her small hands, but Theodore wondered why he couldn't just push her away. The emperor looked at the knights and told them to leave them alone. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and said that if she started talking nonsense, she could immediately lose her position. The young lady, in turn, drooped. She wondered what would happen if he did not believe her. She was afraid of this more than anything in the world, and she wondered if she told Ivan Chernyssia the truth, she could bring him back to his former self. She was very scared and did not know what to do. Now she timidly hesitated and moved away. The emperor grabbed her hand and told her to speak immediately. The young lady called the cue. He understood that there was no way back. She looked at him and asked if he remembered Ivan Chernyssia. The emperor looked at the young lady in shock after she asked this question. Ivan looked at him timidly and said that it was her. She was scared and didn't know what would happen next. The emperor was shocked. He wondered if she was really Ivan. Now he understood why he felt so strange around her. He realized that the young lady really did look very much like her. He was puzzled because he did not feel any magic in her. For this reason, he decided that he was mistaken. A moment later, the emperor felt a pain in his head. The pain was very strong and unbearable. Ivan ran up to the emperor and called him. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what was wrong with him and kept calling Theodore all the time. But the emperor in turn did not answer. Because of his headache, he could not say a word. He kept repeating that she was a fake and just an empty shell. Theodore remembered how it all started, initially. It was not a very happy story. He began to feel threatened by other people at an early age. Theodore realized at an early age that he had acquired the holy power of Reobrante. Theodore in turn knew that his relatives would be furious if they found out what he had. He knew that one young lady was adopted by a noble family in order to marry her off well, and thus she later became an empress. Theodore knew that his mother and her son, of course, did not care about him. Theodore got tired of putting up with this and started killing. He heard people saying that black hair was a bad sign. After such words, he dealt with everyone. Theodore in turn saw that they were identical and senselessly stretched one after the other. But one day he met a beautiful young lady on his way, and for the first time he felt the desire to possess someone. He hoped that she would always be by his side. He wanted to cherish someone. Ivan became the reason for him. The empress looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked what this meant. Theodore in turn knew that, for the sake of his beloved, he was ready to do anything. The prince looked at the empress with a grin and said that the throne would be his. The young prince was furious because a great tragedy had happened. He was careless at the time. The prince was furious. He wondered if they dared to get to her family. He hoped that she was still alive. The prince understood that she had suffered because of his greed. He prayed to heaven every day for her to stay alive. The trace of holy power he left on her body was his last hope, and he believed that he would find her in this way wherever she was. Theodore in turn knew that he needed to eliminate everyone during the storm so that his mistake would not be repeated again. He knew that he needed to be more careful and act more confidently. Theodore in turn went through a difficult and bloody path, but he did all this for the sake of his love. But now he fixed his gaze, looked at the young lady, and wondered who she really was. The emperor was in shock as he had a headache, and his memories came flooding back. At once he did not understand what he had seen, and was confused. He wondered who she really was. When the emperor woke up, he saw a young lady looking at him with a smile on her face and tears in her eyes. Theodore was furious and shocked as his heart pounded wildly when he looked at the young lady. He wondered if it was her appearance. She looked at the emperor and asked with a smile how he was feeling. She breathed a sigh of relief and said that she was very glad that he had woken up. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that she was very worried. The emperor looked at her with bewilderment. He did not understand why she was looking at him like that. He didn't want her to drive him crazy with something that was so similar to his love. He touched her lips tenderly. The young lady looked at him shyly. The emperor was confused. He didn't know if it was all true. A moment later, he was taken aback and pushed her away. He looked at her wrist in confusion and shock and saw that there was no scar. Theodore knew he was right, and this was not his beloved Yvonne. He was furious as he realized that she was just a dirty fake. He pushed her away angrily and told her not to touch him again. Theodore could not forgive her for deceiving him and making him believe for a split second that she was Yvonne. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that she was disgusting to him. He was furious and could not understand how she dared to try to seduce him. The emperor smiled and said that the tea was especially aromatic today, and it was all because he was drinking it with a beautiful lady. The young lady said, with an embarrassed smile, that she was honored to join him. While Emperor Theodore was having a sweet conversation with the young lady, Yvonne stood nearby and closely watched everything that was happening. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled by this situation, and it was painful for her to look at your lover, who is communicating with another. She remembered Theodore looking at her with fury and contempt and telling her not to touch him because she was disgusting to him. The young lady was shocked and wondered why he was treating her like that. She did not understand what had influenced his behavior. She asked furiously why he didn't recognize her. The young lady, looking at the emperor with tears in her eyes, screamed that she was Yvonne. The emperor froze in shock. Yvonne screamed furiously that he had told her before that he loved her with tears in her eyes. She looked at him and asked if that was true. After her words, the emperor screamed as he had a very bad headache. He looked at her with rage and asked who she was. The young lady froze in shock. A moment later, the doctor burst into the room singing in shock as the emperor's condition seemed to be getting better. The doctor looked at the young lady with puzzlement and asked if she had disturbed his memory. Yvonne was shocked. She said that she had not done it at all. The doctor sighed heavily and said that he didn't know why. But if she tried to bring back his memories again, the emperor would experience unbearable pain again. The doctor said that the emperor had a seizure today. Yvonne sighed heavily and wondered if it meant that the emperor had suffered so much because of her. Her heart was heavy after she realized that she had hurt him. The doctor said that they could explain what was happening from a medical point of view, since he had never encountered such a surprisingly selective loss of memory before, and perhaps such a reaction is connected with the fact that he met her just 6 months ago. Yvonne, in turn, should not hurt him. She remembered how he smiled, and how could one forget his beloved girl? She realized that he was just a liar. The young lady sighed heavily. Now she had to watch her man flirt with other people's girls. The emperor looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and began to shower her with compliments. Yvonne, in turn, could not stand it and simply ran away. Now the young lady understood that her position had become a real test for her. From that moment on, the emperor began to regularly invite noble ladies to the palace. She knew that in the present time there was nothing surprising about this, but before it was difficult to imagine, she realized that he was good at captivating girls with sweet speeches. The young lady was simply furious. She did not understand how she had to endure this. Ernst approached his friend and asked why she was crying now. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect to see him. The prince smiled and, puzzled, told her to be quiet, as it would be bad for him if he were seen. The prince sighed heavily and, turning around, said that lately the atmosphere in the palace had been somehow incomprehensible. He asked if something had really happened. The prince looked at her and asked if everything had returned to the time before she appeared. A moment later, she sat down on the ground. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and called out. Ernst was a little surprised as her behavior was different. Ernst looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked what had happened to her, if it really hurt somewhere. He looked at her intently and asked if it was something that had upset her, but the young lady did not answer. But a moment later, the prince hugged her tenderly. He said that there was no need to cry, silently. Yvonne was surprised. The prince consoled her tenderly. He said that, if she wanted, he would stay with her, since they were still friends. After his words, the young lady burst into tears. She hugged her friend tightly. She was very pleased that he was now next to her. The prince sighed heavily when he heard her story. He said that, frankly, speaking what happened made him a little happy. The prince smiled and said that, if the old Theo had noticed them together, he would have torn his head off that very minute. Yvonne was a little surprised, as she suddenly laughed. She said that everything was true. Yvonne looked at the emperor and asked why he was angry. Then the emperor asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. She said that she was talking specifically about the meeting with Ernst. The emperor said that he just didn't like seeing her next to him. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was like that. She said that Ernst was like a brother to her. She asked Theodore if he really doubted her. Theodore said that it was not like that at all, and he was just jealous. He smiled and said sheepishly that he was very jealous of her. He said that for this reason, she should be more careful. The young lady thought for a moment. She wondered when his memory would return, whether he would apologize to her. She in turn was sure that she would not be able to forget everything easily, although she really loved him very much and was ready to forgive a lot. The young lady raised her eyes to the sky. She asked her lover to remember everything quickly. The emperor, meanwhile, was watching Yvonne and Ernst closely from the office window. The emperor, in turn, was very angry, and in his rage, he hit the glass. The young lady was trembling with fear. She looked at the emperor and politely said that she thought it was time for her to go. The emperor, in turn, shouted angrily for her to leave immediately. The emperor stared out the window at the young people. He was furious because he could not understand his true feelings. Having lost his memory, he, without noticing it, began to look for her figure with his eyes. Not a minute passed before he was looking for the figure of a girl who looked very much like his Yvonne. The emperor was furious. He did not understand why she was looking at him like that. He kept repeating that it was a different person. He was furious, and every day his fury grew stronger. He looked at the young lady intently and wondered why he couldn't get her out of his mind. He angrily ordered himself to calm down and stop thinking about the fake. He was furious because he knew it was her fault that he couldn't concentrate. He knew she talked about loving him, but she didn't know anything about him. He was furious because he knew he should get rid of her right away. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew that he had been ignoring her all this time. But today, he simply incinerated her with his gaze. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all. She did not understand why he was behaving this way. For a moment, she felt sad, because she had previously thought that she knew him well, but unfortunately she was wrong. A moment later, a servant entered the emperor's office and said that he had a visitor. The young lady looked at the servant in bewilderment. She did not know who this visitor was and wondered if it was some girl again. Turning around, he looked at her with an intent gaze. She looked at him with bewilderment, since she did not understand what this gaze meant. She didn't understand what was happening to her lately. Yvonne realized that she also needed to follow him. Young Master Benjamin greeted the emperor with all courtesy. The young lady looked at Benjamin in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. Katarina Ferdinand approached them and greeted him. Katarina looked at Yvonne with a sly grin. Yvonne, in turn, was furious, as she did not expect to see her here. She wondered why they had come to the emperor. The emperor glanced sideways at the young lady, and her reaction. Benjamin began to speak in turn, but the young lady interrupted him and said that she had one request. She said with a sly smile that she had a personal conversation with the emperor and asked if they could talk in private. Yvonne stepped forward before the emperor and said that this was out of the question, and as his bodyguard she forbade it. A moment later, the emperor himself placed the young lady and said that he agreed to talk to her alone. Yvonne froze in place, as she did not expect this. Katerina looked at the emperor with a sly smile and thanked him. A moment later, the emperor said that there were only a few people left near his door, and the rest could return. The young lady was in shock. She wondered what they were talking about. Yvonne found it very difficult to be behind a closed door, and she did not want the young people to be alone, as she knew what Katerina was capable of. A moment later, Benjamin came closer to her and hugged her and asked if she could hear him. She looked at her in bewilderment. She apologized and said that they hadn't seen each other for so long, and she hadn't even said hello. She noticed that they were too close to each other. Benjamin smiled a soft smile and said that it wasn't that important. He said that she was probably having a really hard time with her new job. He smiled and said that her hair had already grown out. She smiled and said that it was but still felt very unusual. Benjamin touched her hair affectionately and said with a smile that it suited her very well. She thanked him shyly for the compliment, but in turn she felt very awkward. She understood that it was all because too much time had passed since their last meeting. She now realized that Benjamin seemed like a stranger to her as he looked at her and said with a smile that he would like to talk to her. Benjamin, in turn, did not have time to finish his sentence when he noticed that she was staring intently at the closed door. Katarina looked at the emperor and said that she heard that something bad had happened to him. She asked if he was okay. Emperor Theodore gave her a cold look and told her to stop chatting and get straight to the point. The young lady smiled and said that in that case she would do so. She said that there were rumors that he had been dating girls a lot lately, and they said that Gon was looking for a suitable bride. The emperor was a little surprised since he had been talking to the girls for a long time, and rumors had already spread throughout the empire. The emperor looked at her intently and asked what she wanted to talk about. Theodore asked angrily if she really wanted to propose herself. The young lady looked at him with a sly smile and said that she had many wishes, but she couldn't get everything at once. So today she came with another request. The emperor looked at her with bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Katarina looked at him intently and said that she really wanted to own the Ferdinand family. Katarina looked at the emperor and asked him for help in order to take over her family and status. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was saying. She looked at him and asked if she understood correctly that he was looking for Ivan Chernizia. Theodore froze in place without saying a word. Katarina said with a grin that if he helped her, she would bring this girl to him. Ivan looked at Benjamin and asked if he knew what they were talking about outside the door. Benjamin said that, unfortunately, he knew nothing, since only he had been invited to the palace, but the young lady had decided to go with him too. The young woman was perplexed, as she did not understand why Katarina decided to go to the palace herself. Ivan thought that the young lady would now avoid the emperor in every way after what happened. But still, she knew Katarina very well. Ivan assumed that the young lady was up to something. Ivan knew that Katarina was arrogant and greedy, but she did not make the same mistake twice. Ivan knew that she had no shortage of tenacity. Ivan understood perfectly well that the young lady had come to the imperial palace for a reason, and apparently she wanted to get even for the last time. She was adopted to become an empress. She studied hard all this time. For this, Ivan knew that she would not give up so easily. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and said that he was looking for Ivan Chernizia. Katarina said that if he helped her, she would certainly bring her to him. The emperor looked at her with a frown and asked how she knew this name. The young lady said with a smirk that she wished she could hide the truth. She smiled and said that she needed to win his trust. Katarina said that she learned this name by accident. Late at night, a young lady sneaked into the Ferdinand estate and into the patriarch's office at the top of the tower. It was then that she found documents related to the young lady. The young lady looked at the emperor with a deep gaze and said, "In other words, it can be said that his improvement is entrusted to this family." She smiled a wicked smile and said that it seemed like they were hiding something about Ivan. She knew that they wanted to hide the girl from the family of traitors. The young lady understood that this information was very valuable to the emperor. The emperor was very glad that she was finally able to find her trail. He looked at her and asked if it was possible to get the mentioned documents. Katarina said with a smile that this place was hidden by a family spell, and she herself was only able to go there once. The emperor looked at her intently and said that he could not make her head of the family as long as Benjamin lived. The young lady smiled and said that she could deal with him herself. Theodore looked closely at the young lady and asked what she knew about a girl named Yves Roveline. Katarina looked at the emperor with a grin and said that she had heard a lot about the young lady. Katarina looked at the emperor and said that Eve had become the emperor's own bodyguard. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was all true. He was very puzzled because he could not remember why he had appointed her to this particular position. The young lady looked at him and said that it was very strange and asked why he would trust his safety to someone who had not even finished her training. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant by that. She looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if he felt strange being near her. The emperor froze in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He frowned and thought he remembered their awkward kiss. Katarina, looking at the emperor with a grin, asked if it could be that Benjamin used black magic on her, since this girl had previously studied with him and later suddenly ended up in the palace. The emperor was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He wondered if Benjamin had put a curse on the young lady and sent her to him. Katarina said that even within the family, there were rumors about the young elegy. She said that it was very strange that he kept such a talentless and low-born girl with him. The young lady hoped that the emperor would understand her correctly. She smiled at the emperor and said that he could consider this information her gift in honor of their deal. Katarina said that he could check everything if it was a lie. Then she would lay her own head at his feet. She said with a smile that she hoped this would help earn his trust. The emperor looked at her sideways and said that there was nothing to curry favor with. The emperor pulled her closer to him and said that he would certainly accept her proposal. The emperor was glad, as he had finally found what he was looking for. Theodore knew that this time he would not miss the young lady. A moment later, the young lady and the emperor left the room. Yvonne froze and called out to the emperor, but he did not answer. She was shocked because she saw that Katarina had a death grip on the emperor. Benjamin smiled and said that they seemed to have had a very good conversation. He asked if they could explain to him what was going on. Emperor Theodore, in turn, looked at them with fury. He remembered his conversations with the young lady. Katarina hugged the emperor tightly and whispered tenderly in his ear that he could use her. Katarina told the emperor that with her help, he could get rid of the lousy worms, and he would only have to pretend. A moment later, the emperor looked at everyone and said that he intended to propose to the Ferdinand family. The young lady stood frozen in place in bewilderment. She was in shock and did not understand what he had just said. Yvonne could not believe this situation. The knights whispered among themselves in bewilderment. They could not believe that the emperor wanted to woo this girl. The emperor said that henceforth the young lady should also be greeted with special honors. Katarina looked at Yvonne with a fierce grin on her face. She was glad that everything was going according to her plan. Yvonne was furious. She smashed everything that came her way. She couldn't believe that he just betrayed her. She remembered how he asked her if she would become his wife in a fit of anger. The young lady smashed everything in her path. Yvonne saw that the emperor's gift was lying on the ground. She reached out to it with a trembling hand. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. Yvonne called Theo, but unfortunately, it was all in vain. Benjamin looked at the young lady and said that it looked like she was missing what she wanted. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really thought so. Katarina said that in her opinion, she took what had always belonged to her. He sighed heavily and with a smile told her not to hope that everything would go as planned her. Benjamin asked if she really wanted to see her blood again. The young lady shuddered after this question. The young lady was puzzled and wondered why she had no allies anywhere. She was furious and didn't understand why everyone thought she was bad. She knew that it was Yvonne's fault that she almost ended up on her deathbed. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything she knew, that she would definitely not make a mistake. This time, she could not allow anyone to take away what was rightfully hers. She said with a smirk that he still had to be careful as well. She said that he would have to talk to the emperor because she would now have complete freedom of movement. She looked at him and said with a smile that his face was just an open book. Benjamin smiled and said that perhaps it was Katarina smiled and said that now she would be very busy. She said with a satisfied grin that she needed to get ready for the wedding as soon as possible. Benjamin thought for a moment and said that everything was correct since she would have a hard time at the moment. Some time later, Lady Katarina looked at the mountain of gifts from the emperor with a satisfied smile. The emperor smiled and told her to be sure to tell him if she liked anything, and the young lady was simply delighted with everything. The emperor looked at her and said with a smile that he was ready to get her anything she wanted. Katarina thanked her with a smile. Everyone present was simply shocked by what was happening. They were embarrassed to hear something like that. A moment later, she hugged him tightly and said with a smile that no one had ever tried so hard for her before. Katarina smiled and said that when he was next to her, it was as if she could embrace the whole world. She asked if she could really take all the gifts for herself. He smiled and said that she could take everything because she deserved it. All the young lady looked at the emperor with loving eyes. The emperor looked at the maids and told them to select suitable, luxurious dresses for the young lady. Katarina gave the emperor a beautiful and radiant smile and said that she would certainly return soon. The young man looked at the emperor and asked if he really intended to marry her. The emperor did not even look at his assistant a moment later. He asked why he did not do it. The man sighed heavily. He knew that there were many reasons for this, as the young lady was the niece of the former empress, who was killed by the emperor. The man sighed heavily and told the emperor that the main thing was that he was happy. The emperor did not look at him, but still replied that he was completely satisfied with everything. He knew that he was ready to do everything for his goal. The emperor wanted to meet his love, and he knew that he would spare neither money nor life. He sincerely wanted to see her beautiful smile again. The emperor looked at the young lady intently. Theodore was furious. He wanted her out of his way. The young lady came closer to him and said that she would like to talk to him. The emperor looked at her with fury as he noticed the decoration on her head. Theodore angrily asked where she got this decoration from. Yvonne remembered how her beloved emperor gave her a piece of jewelry and said that it would look great on her short hair. The young lady smiled and said that she would only wear it on special occasions. Yvonne looked at the emperor intently and asked if he didn't remember. She said that he himself gave her this pen. A moment later, the emperor felt dizzy again, and his headaches returned. The emperor was furious as she was giving him a splitting headache, and he wondered if there was some black magic involved. Yvonne sighed heavily and said that he didn't seem to care about what she was saying right now. She looked at him and handed him the document. She said that she had written down the events of the previous 6 months. The young lady looked at Theodore intently and said that if he wanted to know who she was, he should read this report. The emperor was furious. He didn't understand what she thought of herself. He wondered who she was to give orders. But he still wanted to know very much. The emperor pulled the documents towards the young lady in order to take the information she wanted to give him. A moment later, he froze in place as he heard someone calling him. The emperor turned around. He heard a distinctly familiar voice and wondered if it was Yvonne. Katarina, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked who it was. She ran closer to the emperor and said that they seemed to be very busy. She asked if she had interrupted their conversation. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said with a smirk that she had a lovely hairpin. Yvonne, in turn, looked at the lady with fury because she knew that she did everything on purpose. Katarina hugged the emperor tightly and with a grin said that she wanted this hairpin. Katarina asked Theodore if he would give her the hairpin. The emperor sighed heavily as he realized that he had simply imagined everything looking at Yvonne. Theodore said that she should give the hairpin to Katarina. The young lady looked at her with a smirk and asked if she had heard. Katarina extended her hand and told Yvonne to hand over the jewelry immediately. Yvonne gave her a furious look and refused to comply. Katarina looked at her with fury and asked what she had just said. Katarina called Theodore to resolve this situation. The emperor came closer to the young lady and snatched her sword, which was hanging on her belt. She looked at Theodore with bewilderment. A moment later, he struck her, the young lady's beautiful hair flying across the room, her hairpin crashing to the ground. The young lady froze in place. She was shocked by what he did. Her heart was unbearably painful. She no longer saw her beloved. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that now she had nothing to decorate. The emperor, in turn, slowly walked away. He knew that he would not return. He realized that he was too careless then and lost his love, but now he will not repeat his mistake. The young lady smirked as she looked at them. She was glad that she was able to hurt Yvonne. The emperor looked at the young lady who was crying with rage. He knew that he had only one path, and if anyone interfered with him, he would immediately deal with that person. He knew that he would not forgive any forger who stood in his way. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked with a smile if they could go back already. The emperor smiled and said that he would like to be alone with her for a little while longer. Yvonne, in turn, knew that constantly running away from work under various pretexts would not lead to anything good. She remembered the emperor's assistant, who with tears in his eyes asked him to return to work. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and asked if he couldn't do something like that. His words and look sent a shudder through her heart, and she said embarrassedly that he could only do this today. She looked away, full of embarrassment, and said that he looked very tired, so he could rest a little. The emperor smiled since yesterday or the day before. She said the same thing. The young lady was shocked because she did not know what she would say to the emperor's assistant. Theodore looked at the young lady and said that he wished winter would come sooner. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he wished winter so much. Was he really too hot? The emperor smiled and said that she didn't like summer. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that it was true, because the heat made it hard for her to train and work. But still, she loved the summer. The young lady moved slowly and kissed Theodore. She smiled tenderly and said that it was in the summer that they first met. The emperor looked at her with embarrassment and said with a smile that it seemed she remembered even such things. She smiled and said that if we talk about seasons, she hates winter. Yvonne said it was a very cold and cruel time, a time when you could lose what you loved. The emperor smiled and said tenderly that he would make her love this time. He smiled and said that he wanted her to love autumn, winter, spring. He said tenderly that he would always be with her. The young lady in turn stood with tears in her eyes and looked at the fire. She burned her memories because she knew that before there would never be again. She knew he was the only person she could trust. But now, unfortunately, there is no one left in the world who taught her to love, the young lady said with a smile that it seemed to be snowing. The emperor looked at the snow that was falling. He was a little puzzled as he hated winter. He knew that in this cold time of year, they lose what they love. The emperor was furious, for he saw that she had again shown him all her cruelty. The emperor and the young lady entered the room, and the emperor ordered everyone to leave. A moment later, he pushed the young lady away. She was taken aback, but obeyed. She said that he changes very abruptly. As soon as they are alone, she said that he is her dear fiancé. The emperor looked at the young lady closely and said that it was just their agreement. He asked if she really thought that he could fall in love with her. The young lady looked at the emperor intently, but did not answer. A moment later, she said that he never gave her that hairpin. She said that people wouldn't understand, especially after he literally snatched her away from that girl. She smiled and said it would be very strange if she didn't wear it. She didn't have time to finish speaking when suddenly the emperor came closer to her with fury and looked at her with a stern gaze. He asked if she had forgotten who she was talking to. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't know what to answer. He said angrily that they had agreed that she would pretend to be his fiancé until he helped her get the position of head of the family. She was frightened as she saw that the wall under his fist began to crumble. Theodore said with fury that if she thought that she could claim anything more, then she was cruelly mistaken. The young lady in turn said with fury that he had been staring at Eve all this time. She said that even while kissing her, he was thinking about her all the time, and she simply could not help but notice something like that. The emperor was shocked because he realized that it was too obvious. The young lady in turn knew that he loved her very much, but at the same time, he could not forget his first love from childhood. She looked at him intently and said that he should not forget the terms of the deal at all, since her job was to find Yvonne's trail. She looked at him intently and said that Eve belonged to Benjamin. The emperor looked at the young lady with a gray expression and said that there was still no evidence that she was using dark magic. Katarina looked at the emperor with a smirk. She saw that he was still clinging to her. She looked at the emperor closely and said that he was getting sick around Eve. She knew that they could not be allowed to stay close to each other any longer. The young lady looked at him with a keen gaze and said with a smirk that she had an idea. She asked his permission to take care of Eve. The young lady looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The emperor, without even looking at her, said that he would not repeat it twice. As he had said earlier, she would take the place of Katarina's bodyguard. The young lady was angry with the emperor. She said that it was simply impossible since she was supposed to protect him. The emperor slammed his hand down on the table in anger, and the young lady in turn recoiled, surprised by his behavior. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really wanted him to draw his sword again. He furiously told her to obey the order immediately. The emperor remembered how Katarina had asked his permission to take care of Eve. She said that she would definitely find evidence that she was guilty. The young lady looked at Yvonne intently and smirked and told her to come closer to her. She wanted to prove to the emperor that Yvonne was using dark magic. Katarina looked at the young lady with a grin and said that this hairstyle suits her very well, since short hair looks much better. Katarina said with a smirk that it was beneath her status to grow long hair, and Yvonne was furious. Katarina asked with a grin if she was right, but Yvonne in turn did not answer. A moment later, Katarina told the young lady to sit down as she wanted to have a chat with her in a ladies' circle. Yvonne was furious and did not know what she was planning. Yvonne didn't understand why the young lady made her bodyguard. Katarina looked at her with a grin and said that it seemed like she had a lot of questions, but she in turn also had something to say. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said that they should still be honest with each other. Yvonne looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked why she needed her protection. Katarina said with a fierce grin that she just needed her help since it was her first time in the palace, so she decided to find the person who knew everything about the castle. Katarina looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that His Majesty had kindly granted her request. Katarina looked at Yvonne with a grin and said that now it was her turn. Katarina said that she had risen a lot recently since she was a high-ranking knight, and the Emperor's personal bodyguard Katarina, without taking her gaze off the young lady, asked with a grin how she managed to do this. Yvonne looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant. Katarina, with a fierce grin, said that everyone was curious how such a girl as she had achieved such heights. Katarina looked at the young lady and asked with a smirk if she had simply seduced the Emperor. All the maids stared at the young lady as they waited for her answer. Katarina said that such rumors were circulating. Yvonne was furious. She looked at Katarina and asked what nonsense she was talking about. During the conversation, Katarina burned herself and shouted that it was very painful because the tea was hot. The maids rushed at the young lady with lightning speed and asked if she was all right. Katarina looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was doing. She shouted that now she would have a scar. Yvonne, in turn, saw that the young lady's skin had merely turned slightly red. Katarina looked at her with fury and asked if she really hadn't understood anything yet. Katarina said that Emperor Theodore handed Yvonne over to her, and she enjoyed it this. Katarina looked at the young lady with fury and said that she was now her mistress, as she had been before. Yvonne looked at the young lady with anger and fury and told her not to dare to say Theo's name with her filthy mouth. Katarina smirked and looked at the young lady and said that she was indeed crazy. She came closer to her and asked with a smirk if she really thought that she still meant something to him. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said that she would tell her in confidence that he didn't give a damn about trash like her. Katarina smiled and said that the Emperor had been kind and generous to her. Looking at Yvonne, she said that he always finds time for privacy and compliments her. Katarina said with a smirk that that was the difference between her and Yvonne, and a moment later she snapped her fingers and signaled to her maids. The maids instantly tied up Yvonne and did not let her escape. Yvonne, in turn, screamed she did not understand what they were doing. She screamed for them to let her go. Katarina looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she should blame the Emperor for everything. She picked up the teapot and looked at it intently. Katarina knew that it was the Emperor who ordered her to prove Eve's involvement in dark magic by any means necessary. The young lady looked at the knight with a smirk and said that she thought her body still remembered Yvonne was trembling with anger and fear. To her regret, she could not break free. Katarina said with a smirk that it was time to teach her a lesson and remind her how she shouldn't talk to her. A moment later, the room was filled with screams. Ernst, standing behind the column, quietly heard the knights' conversations. They were saying that the atmosphere in the imperial castle had been simply disgusting lately. They were shocked because they saw that the Emperor had previously behaved like a normal person, but again turned into a tyrant. They were shocked, and they didn't like everything that was happening, and I also liked his new bride. The knights were perplexed, as screams were constantly heard from her room. They were in shock and did not understand what was going on there. They did not know what would await them next. Ernst was in shock, did not understand what was going on. He wondered if what he had heard was true, and if Katarina and Theodore were engaged. The prince was shocked and wondered what was really going on in the imperial palace. He understood that he could not just stand aside and watch everything that was happening. He understood that Katarina could not be allowed to become empress under any circumstances. He knew that he first needed to find his girlfriend and find out what had happened while he was gone. A moment later, the prince saw his friend and ran up to her. He smiled and said that it was very good that he found her. Turning around, she looked at him with a sad and heavy look. The prince was taken aback because he did not understand what had happened to her. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and asked what this all meant. He saw that she was all wounded. The prince was furious. The young lady with tears in her eyes said that it was all no use, and no matter how hard she tried, he would not even admit that she was Yvonne. She understood that she would no longer be able to bring back her lover Theo. The prince looked closely at his friend and said that she needed to go with him. He said that she could no longer stay in the imperial palace. The young lady froze in bewilderment as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince looked at her and said sadly that she should have run away much earlier. He did not understand why she continued to tolerate the abuse towards herself. She sighed heavily and said that she had nowhere to go. Meanwhile, the emperor was writhing in pain. He was sleeping and he was having nightmares. He saw his beloved, who was burning in the fire. He heard her scream. She said that she was in great pain. The emperor saw her and heard her asking him for help. He was furious. A moment later, he ran towards her and said that he would save her. Now he shouted that he would save her no matter what happened. But a moment later, she looked at him sharply and said it was too late. She screamed that it was all because of him. She screamed that he had angered the empress, and she had taken it out on her. The emperor was shocked because he knew it was entirely his fault. He heard her screaming that she could not forgive him. She screamed that, because of him, her family was dead. The emperor woke up with tears in his eyes and found it difficult to breathe. He sat down on the bed and sighed heavily as he realized that this was just another dream. The emperor sighed heavily as he had not seen her for a long time. He thought that it would be better for him not to think about it. He knew that she was definitely alive, but a moment later, he suddenly felt a flow of power. He noticed that his hands were shaking very strongly. The emperor's assistant looked at him closely and asked if he was all right. The assistant said that he was glad to see him at work, but still he advised the emperor not to overdo it. The man asked the emperor if he was sleeping poorly again. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had enough of this idle chatter. The emperor asked him how things were going. The man felt heavy, sighed, and said that everything remained unchanged. He said that the only survivor, Madame Grace, had returned to her home, and although she was looked after day and night, her illness was so severe that she could hardly speak. The man said that the bodies of Yvonne and Brian were never found, and the emperor thought for a moment about his beloved. Emperor Yu, in turn, tried many times to find her with the help of your magic, but she seemed to dissolve into thin air. He sighed heavily because not long ago he felt her trace, but now he did not understand why the trace suddenly disappeared. Closing his eyes, the emperor saw the young lady. He was shocked and bewildered. He was in shock and didn't understand why he was seeing that girl again. He was furious because his thoughts kept returning to her, to the girl who looked strangely like Yvonne. He noticed that as soon as she moved away, his head began to hurt less. He sighed heavily and asked his assistant how Eve was doing. The man thought for a moment and said that he did not know, since almost nothing had been heard of her since she went into Katarina's service. Theodore knew that if Katarina had found traces of dark magic, she would have bragged about it, but he realized that there was apparently no result yet. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had to meet the young lady. The assistant looked at the emperor and asked if he needed to send servants for her. The emperor said with a grin that there was no need for that, and he would rather arrange a surprise for my bride. Meanwhile, the young lady sat quietly and sipped tea while her maids cleaned the room. She was very happy because finally she could enjoy life. Normally, she saw beautiful diamonds, beautiful dresses. She was very happy that the place of the empress would soon be hers. She was glad that she had put the young upstart in her place and taught her a good lesson. Katarina knew that Yvonne must understand that taking what belongs to someone else is wrong. The maid approached the young lady and asked if she was afraid. Katarina looked at the maid in bewilderment. The maid said that, after all, Eve was close to His Majesty, the Emperor. The young lady looked at the maid with a grin and told her not to worry, because nothing terrible had happened until she told anyone. Then, in the room of the patriarch of the Ferdinand family, she definitely found records about dark magic. She was shocked, did not understand why these records were here, but unfortunately, she understood little of them then. But she was sure that Benjamin and Eve were going to use dark magic against the Emperor, She thought that perhaps the young lady was going to seduce the emperor in this way. Katarina was puzzled by the fact that no matter how much she tortured her, she did not admit her guilt. However, she knew that the emperor already trusted her. The young lady said with a grin that even if Theodore found out, nothing would happen, since no matter what she did with Eve, he would not blink an eye. A moment later, the emperor entered the room and asked angrily what this meant. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She looked at the emperor and with a trembling voice called out to him. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that she had better explain everything right now. At times, the young lady lay quietly in bed. She was very exhausted. The emperor slowly approached her bed. He saw what condition she was in. The prince came up behind his brother and told him to be quiet, as the young lady had just fallen asleep. The emperor looked at him with fury and asked what he was doing here. The prince looked intently at the emperor, but said nothing. Ernst looked at the emperor intently and said that his girlfriend was in a terrible state, so he brought her here. The emperor looked at him in bewilderment, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The emperor looked at his brother with anger and asked the cheese why he was calling his knight by name. The prince was furious. He looked at the emperor and asked if he knew what had happened to his knight. Ernst said that the young lady was covered in everything from bruises to burns, and the prince said that he believed the emperor already knew where it all came from. The emperor shouted in anger and asked if he could read other people's thoughts. The emperor said that she herself decided not to tell anyone anything. The prince looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked if he really thought so. The prince said that it was the emperor's bride who had abused the young lady supposedly, with his permission, and asked why she would complain to anyone. Ernst looked at the emperor with fury and said that he was the one who forced her to keep silent about what was happening. The emperor froze in place from shock. A moment later, the prince asked the emperor for forgiveness for his unnecessary words. The prince sighed heavily, and as he left, said that it would be better for the emperor not to do something that he would later bitterly regret. He said that this was his last request. Ernst remembered how he called his girlfriend. He sincerely wanted her to go with him. The young lady smiled and thanked her friend for his help. She said that she could not do this because the emperor had been waiting for her for many years. The prince cried because he couldn't stand it. He knew she was just a fool when she told him words of gratitude for his support. He thought she was just a stupid girl. At the same time, the emperor sat next to the young lady's bed and looked at her intently. The emperor was shocked because his brother said that he was entirely to blame for everything. Katarina looked at the emperor and said with fury that Eve attacked her first, and while she was pouring tea on her and mocking her, the young lady asked the emperor to believe her. The emperor looked at the young lady with fury and asked if it was his knight who attacked her first. He said that it simply could not be. He knew that she had many shortcomings, but she would not do such a stupid thing. Katarina looked at the emperor with anger and asked if he really did not want to believe in his bride. The emperor said that if his knight had harmed her, then she should have turned to him first, since by her behavior she had violated the laws of the palace. The young lady looked at the emperor with fury and said that he himself had given her permission to obtain evidence by any means necessary. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him intently and asked if he was talking to her about laws. She said that he himself had broken every possible rule to ascend to the throne. She said that she was also ready to do anything for him. The emperor sighed heavily as he looked at the young lady who was sleeping peacefully. He had told her earlier to go away and not bother him or get in his way, but she still stayed by his side. He didn't understand why she acted this way. The emperor kissed her hand, tenderly, filled with guilt. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if his greed for her was also the influence of dark magic. The emperor looked closely at the young sleeping lady and stroked her face tenderly. A moment later, he moved closer to her. The emperor kissed her tenderly, and from his kiss, the young lady woke up. She looked in surprise at the blurry silhouette in front of her. She was shocked and wondered if this was really her Theodore. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw that he was kissing her. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening at all, but still she wanted to be close to him and did not push him away when he kissed her tenderly. But a moment later, the young lady in turn saw the silhouette of a woman who asked with a smirk if she was really going to seduce the emperor. A moment later, she pushed the emperor away and told him to wait a little. Ivan looked at him in confusion and asked what he had just done. She wondered if his memory had returned. The emperor asked why she had pushed him away. He asked if this was not what she had been seeking all along. He came closer to her and asked if this was the reason she had wanted to get him, and for this reason had stayed by his side, despite everything. A moment later, he threw her on the bed and said in an angry voice that he would fulfill her wish. The emperor kissed her tenderly. The young lady wriggled and said that she had not intended to do this at all. The emperor angrily told her not to dare run away, since she herself had become attached to him. He asked if she had already confused him with someone else. A moment later, the young lady pulled him towards her and said that it was not like that at all. She knew that before, and now she didn't need anyone except him. They tenderly merged in a passionate kiss. Katarina was in shock. She stood behind the door and heard and saw everything. She was furious. Katarina said with a grin that if he helped her, she would bring this girl to him. Ivan looked at Benjamin and asked if he knew what they were talking about outside the door. Benjamin said that, unfortunately, he knew nothing, since only he had been invited to the palace, but the young lady had decided to go with him too. The young woman was perplexed, as she did not understand why Katarina decided to go to the palace herself. Ivan thought that the young lady would now avoid the emperor in every way after what happened. But still, she knew Katarina very well. Ivan assumed that the young lady was up to something. Ivan knew that Katarina was arrogant and greedy, but she did not make the same mistake twice. Ivan knew that she had no shortage of tenacity. Ivan understood perfectly well that the young lady had come to the imperial palace for a reason, and apparently she wanted to get even for the last time. She was adopted to become an empress. She studied hard all this time. For this, Ivan knew that she would not give up so easily. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and said that he was looking for Ivan Chernisha. Katerina said that if he helped her, she would certainly bring her to him. The emperor looked at her with a frown and asked how she knew this name. The young lady said with a smirk that she wished she could hide the truth. She smiled and said that she needed to win his trust. Katerina said that she learned this name by accident. Late at night, a young lady sneaked into the Ferdinand estate and into the patriarch's office at the top of the tower. It was then that she found documents related to the young lady. The young lady looked at the emperor with a deep gaze and said, "In other words, it can be said that his improvement is entrusted to this family." She smiled a wicked smile and said that it seemed like they were hiding something about Ivan. She knew that they wanted to hide the girl from the family of traitors. The young lady understood that this information was very valuable to the emperor. The emperor was very glad that she was finally able to find her trail. He looked at her and asked if it was possible to get the mentioned documents. Katerina said with a smile that this place was hidden by a family spell, and she herself was only able to go there once. The emperor looked at her intently and said that he could not make her head of the family as long as Benjamin lived. The young lady smiled and said that she could deal with him herself. Theodore looked closely at the young lady and asked what she knew about a girl named Yves Roveline. Katerina looked at the emperor with a grin and said that she had heard a lot about the young lady. Katerina looked at the emperor and said that Yves had become the emperor's own bodyguard. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was all true. He was very puzzled because he could not remember why he had appointed her to this particular position. The young lady looked at him and said that it was very strange and asked why he would trust his safety to someone who had not even finished her training. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant by that. She looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if he felt strange being near her. The emperor froze in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He frowned and thought he remembered their awkward kiss. Katerina, looking at the emperor with a grin, asked if it could be that Benjamin used black magic on her, since this girl had previously studied with him and later suddenly ended up in the palace. The emperor was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He wondered if Benjamin had put a curse on the young lady and sent her to him. Katerina said that even within the family, there were rumors about the young elegy. She said that it was very strange that he kept such a talentless and low-born girl with him. The young lady hoped that the emperor would understand her correctly. She smiled at the emperor and said that he could consider this information her gift in honor of their deal. Katerina said that he could check everything if it was a lie. Then she would lay her own head at his feet. She said with a smile that she hoped this would help earn his trust. The emperor looked at her sideways and said that there was nothing to curry favor with. The emperor pulled her closer to him and said that he would certainly accept her proposal. The emperor was glad as he had finally found what he was looking for. Theodore knew that this time he would not miss the young lady. A moment later, the young lady and the emperor left the room. Yvonne froze and called out to the emperor, but he did not answer. She was shocked because she saw that Katarina had a death grip on the emperor. Benjamin smiled and said that they seemed to have had a very good conversation. He asked if they could explain to him what was going on. Emperor Theodore, in turn, looked at them with fury. He remembered his conversations with the young lady. Katarina hugged the emperor tightly and whispered tenderly in his ear that he could use her. Katarina told the emperor that with her help, he could get rid of the lousy worms, and he would only have to pretend. A moment later, the emperor looked at everyone and said that he intended to propose to the Ferdinand family. The young lady stood frozen in place in bewilderment. She was in shock and did not understand what he had just said. Yvonne could not believe this situation. The knights whispered among themselves in bewilderment. They could not believe that the emperor wanted to woo this girl. The emperor said that henceforth the young lady should also be greeted with special honors. Katarina looked at Yvonne with a fierce grin on her face. She was glad that everything was going according to her plan. Yvonne was furious. She smashed everything that came her way. She couldn't believe that he just betrayed her. She remembered how he asked her if she would become his wife in a fit of anger. The young lady smashed everything in her path. Yvonne saw that the emperor's gift was lying on the ground. She reached out to it with a trembling hand. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. Yvonne called Theo, but unfortunately, it was all in vain. Benjamin looked at the young lady and said that it looked like she was missing what she wanted. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really thought so. Katarina said that in her opinion, she took what had always belonged to her. He sighed heavily and with a smile told her not to hope that everything would go as planned her. Benjamin asked if she really wanted to see her blood again. The young lady shuddered after this question. The young lady was puzzled and wondered why she had no allies anywhere. She was furious and didn't understand why everyone thought she was bad. She knew that it was Yvonne's fault that she almost ended up on her deathbed. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything she knew, that she would definitely not make a mistake. This time, she could not allow anyone to take away what was rightfully hers. She said with a smirk that he still had to be careful as well. She said that he would have to talk to the emperor because she would now have complete freedom of movement. She looked at him and said with a smile that his face was just an open book. Benjamin smiled and said that perhaps it was Katarina smiled and said that now she would be very busy. She said with a satisfied grin that she needed to get ready for the wedding as soon as possible. Benjamin thought for a moment and said that everything was correct since she would have a hard time at the moment. Some time later, Lady Katarina looked at the mountain of gifts from the emperor with a satisfied smile. The emperor smiled and told her to be sure to tell him if she liked anything, and the young lady was simply delighted with everything. The emperor looked at her and said with a smile that he was ready to get her anything she wanted. Katarina thanked her with a smile. Everyone present was simply shocked by what was happening. They were embarrassed to hear something like that. A moment later, she hugged him tightly and said with a smile that no one had ever tried so hard for her before. Katarina smiled and said that when he was next to her, it was as if she could embrace the whole world. She asked if she could really take all the gifts for herself. He smiled and said that she could take everything because she deserved it. All the young lady looked at the emperor with loving eyes. The emperor looked at the maids and told them to select suitable, luxurious dresses for the young lady. Katarina gave the emperor a beautiful and radiant smile and said that she would certainly return soon. The young man looked at the emperor and asked if he really intended to marry her. The emperor did not even look at his assistant a moment later. He asked why he did not do it. The man sighed heavily. He knew that there were many reasons for this, as the young lady was the niece of the former empress, who was killed by the emperor. The man sighed heavily and told the emperor that the main thing was that he was happy. The emperor did not look at him, but still replied that he was completely satisfied with everything. He knew that he was ready to do everything for his goal. The emperor wanted to meet his love, and he knew that he would spare neither money nor life. He sincerely wanted to see her beautiful smile again. The emperor looked at the young lady intently. Theodore was furious he wanted her out of his way. The young lady came closer to him and said that she would like to talk to him. The emperor looked at her with fury as he noticed the decoration on her head. Theodore angrily asked where she got this decoration from. Yvonne remembered how her beloved emperor gave her a piece of jewelry and said that it would look great on her short hair. The young lady smiled and said that she would only wear it on special occasions. Yvonne looked at the emperor intently and asked if he didn't remember. She said that he himself gave her this pen. A moment later, the emperor felt dizzy again, and his headaches returned. The emperor was furious as she was giving him a splitting headache, and he wondered if there was some black magic involved. Yvonne sighed heavily and said that he didn't seem to care about what she was saying right now. She looked at him and handed him the document. She said that she had written down the events of the previous 6 months. The young lady looked at Theodore intently and said that if he wanted to know who she was, he should read this report. The emperor was furious. He didn't understand what she thought of herself. He wondered who she was to give orders. But he still wanted to know very much. The emperor pulled the documents towards the young lady in order to take the information she wanted to give him. A moment later, he froze in place as he heard someone calling him. The emperor turned around. He heard a distinctly familiar voice and wondered if it was Yvonne. Katarina, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked who it was. She ran closer to the emperor and said that they seemed to be very busy. She asked if she had interrupted their conversation. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said with a smirk that she had a lovely hairpin. Yvonne, in turn, looked at the lady with fury because she knew that she did everything on purpose. Katarina hugged the emperor tightly and with a grin said that she wanted this hairpin. Katarina asked Theodore if he would give her the hairpin. The emperor sighed heavily as he realized that he had simply imagined everything looking at Yvonne. Theodore said that she should give the hairpin to Katarina. The young lady looked at her with a smirk and asked if she had heard. Katarina extended her hand and told Yvonne to hand over the jewelry immediately. Yvonne gave her a furious look and refused to comply. Katarina looked at her with fury and asked what she had just said. Katarina called Theodore to resolve this situation. The emperor came closer to the young lady and snatched her sword, which was hanging on her belt. She looked at Theodore with bewilderment. A moment later, he struck her the young lady's beautiful hair flying across the room, her hairpin crashing to the ground. The young lady froze in place. She was shocked by what he did. Her heart was unbearably painful. She no longer saw her beloved. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that now she had nothing to decorate. The emperor, in turn, slowly walked away. He knew that he would not return. He realized that he was too careless then and lost his love, but now he will not repeat his mistake. The young lady smirked as she looked at them. She was glad that she was able to hurt Yvonne. The emperor looked at the young lady who was crying with rage. He knew that he had only one path, and if anyone interfered with him, he would immediately deal with that person. He knew that he would not forgive any forger who stood in his way. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked with a smile if they could go back already. The emperor smiled and said that he would like to be alone with her for a little while longer. Yvonne, in turn, knew that constantly running away from work under various pretexts would not lead to anything good. She remembered the emperor's assistant, who with tears in his eyes asked him to return to work. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and asked if he couldn't do something like that. His words and look sent a shudder through her heart, and she said embarrassedly that he could only do this today. She looked away, full of embarrassment, and said that he looked very tired, so he could rest a little. The emperor smiled since yesterday or the day before. She said the same thing. The young lady was shocked because she did not know what she would say to the emperor's assistant. Theodore looked at the young lady and said that he wished winter would come sooner. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he wished winter so much. Was he really too hot? The emperor smiled and said that she didn't like summer. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that it was true, because the heat made it hard for her to train and work, but still she loved the summer. The young lady moved slowly and kissed Theodore. She smiled tenderly and said that it was in the summer that they first met. The emperor looked at her with embarrassment and said with a smile that it seemed she remembered even such things. She smiled and said that if we talk about seasons, she hates winter. Yvonne said it was a very cold and cruel time, a time when you could lose what you loved. The emperor smiled and said tenderly that he would make her love this time. He smiled and said that he wanted her to love autumn, winter, spring. He said tenderly that he would always be with her. The young lady in turn stood with tears in her eyes and looked at the fire. She burned her memories because she knew that before there would never be again. She knew he was the only person she could trust. But now, unfortunately, there is no one left in the world who taught her to love, the young lady said with a smile that it seemed to be snowing. The emperor looked at the snow that was falling. He was a little puzzled as he hated winter. He knew that in this cold time of year, they lose what they love. The emperor was furious, for he saw that she had again shown him all her cruelty. The emperor and the young lady entered the room, and the emperor ordered everyone to leave. A moment later, he pushed the young lady away. She was taken aback, but obeyed. She said that he changes very abruptly. As soon as they are alone, she said that he is her dear fiancé. The emperor looked at the young lady closely and said that it was just their agreement. He asked if she really thought that he could fall in love with her. The young lady looked at the emperor intently, but did not answer. A moment later, she said that he never gave her that hairpin. She said that people wouldn't understand, especially after he literally snatched her away from that girl. She smiled and said it would be very strange if she didn't wear it. She didn't have time to finish speaking, when suddenly the emperor came closer to her with fury and looked at her with a stern gaze. He asked if she had forgotten who she was talking to. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't know what to answer. He said angrily that they had agreed that she would pretend to be his fiancé until he helped her get the position of head of the family. She was frightened as she saw that the wall under his fist began to crumble. Theodore said with fury that if she thought that she could claim anything more, then she was cruelly mistaken. The young lady in turn said with fury that he had been staring at Eve all this time. She said that even while kissing her, he was thinking about her all the time, and she simply could not help but notice something like that. The emperor was shocked because he realized that it was too obvious. The young lady in turn knew that he loved her very much, but at the same time, he could not forget his first love from childhood. She looked at him intently and said that he should not forget the terms of the deal at all, since her job was to find Yvonne's trail. She looked at him intently and said that Eve belonged to Benjamin. The emperor looked at the young lady with a gray expression and said that there was still no evidence that she was using dark magic. Katarina looked at the emperor. With a smirk, she saw that he was still clinging to her. She looked at the emperor closely and said that he was getting sick around Eve. She knew that they could not be allowed to stay close to each other any longer. The young lady looked at him with a keen gaze and said with a smirk that she had an idea. She asked his permission to take care of Eve. The young lady looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The emperor, without even looking at her, said that he would not repeat it twice. As he had said earlier, she would take the place of Katarin's bodyguard. The young lady was angry with the emperor. She said that it was simply impossible since she was supposed to protect him. The emperor slammed his hand down on the table in anger, and the young lady in turn recoiled, surprised by his behavior. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really wanted him to draw his sword again. He furiously told her to obey the order immediately. The emperor remembered how Katarina had asked his permission to take care of Eve. She said that she would definitely find evidence that she was guilty. The young lady looked at Yvonne intently and smirked and told her to come closer to her. She wanted to prove to the emperor that Yvonne was using dark magic. Katarina looked at the young lady with a grin and said that this hairstyle suits her very well, since short hair looks much better. Katarina said with a smirk that it was beneath her status to grow long hair, and Yvonne was furious. Katarina asked with a grin if she was right, but Yvonne in turn did not answer. A moment later, Katarina told the young lady to sit down as she wanted to have a chat with her in a ladies' circle. Yvonne was furious and did not know what she was planning. Yvonne didn't understand why the young lady made her her bodyguard. Katarina looked at her with a grin and said that it seemed like she had a lot of questions, but she in turn also had something to say. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said that they should still be honest with each other. Yvonne looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked why she needed her protection. Katarina said with a fierce grin that she just needed her help since it was her first time in the palace, so she decided to find the person who knew everything about the castle. Katarina looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that His Majesty had kindly granted her request. Katarina looked at Ivan with a grin and said that now it was her turn. Katarina said that she had risen a lot recently since she was a high-ranking knight, and the emperor's personal bodyguard Katarina, without taking her gaze off the young lady, asked with a grin how she managed to do this. Ivan looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant. Katarina, with a fierce grin, said that everyone was curious how such a girl as she had achieved such heights. Katarina looked at the young lady and asked with a smirk if she had simply seduced the emperor. All the maids stared at the young lady as they waited for her answer. Katarina said that such rumors were circulating. Yvonne was furious. She looked at Katarina and asked what nonsense she was talking about. During the conversation, Katarina burned herself and shouted that it was very painful because the tea was hot. The maids rushed at the young lady with lightning speed and asked if she was all right. Katarina looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was doing. She shouted that now she would have a scar. Yvonne, in turn, saw that the young lady's skin had merely turned slightly red. Katarina looked at her with fury and asked if she really hadn't understood anything yet. Katarina said that Emperor Theodore handed Yvonne over to her, and she enjoyed it this. Katarina looked at the young lady with fury and said that she was now her mistress, as she had been before. Yvonne looked at the young lady with anger and fury and told her not to dare to say Theo's name with her filthy mouth. Katarina smirked and looked at the young lady and said that she was indeed crazy. She came closer to her and asked with a smirk if she really thought that she still meant something to him. Katarina looked at Yvonne intently and said that she would tell her in confidence that he didn't give a damn about trash like her. Katarina smiled and said that the emperor had been kind and generous to her. Looking at Yvonne, she said that he always finds time for privacy and compliments her. Katarina said with a smirk that that was the difference between her and Yvonne, and a moment later she snapped her fingers and signaled to her maids. The maids instantly tied up Yvonne and did not let her escape. Yvonne, in turn, screamed she did not understand what they were doing. She screamed for them to let her go. Katarina looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she should blame the emperor for everything. She picked up the teapot and looked at it intently. Katarina knew that it was the emperor who ordered her to prove Eve's involvement in dark magic by any means necessary. The young lady looked at the knight with a smirk and said that she thought her body still remembered Yvonne was trembling with anger and fear. To her regret, she could not break free. Katarina said with a smirk that it was time to teach her a lesson and remind her how she shouldn't talk to her. A moment later, the room was filled with screams. Ernst, standing behind the column, quietly heard the knight's conversations. They were saying that the atmosphere in the imperial castle had been simply disgusting lately. They were shocked because they saw that the emperor had previously behaved like a normal person, but again turned into a tyrant. They were shocked, and they didn't like everything that was happening, and I also liked his new bride. The knights were perplexed, as screams were constantly heard from her room. They were in shock and did not understand what was going on there. They did not know what would await them next. Ernst was in shock, did not understand what was going on. He wondered if what he had heard was true, and if Katarina and Theodore were engaged. The prince was shocked and wondered what was really going on in the imperial palace. He understood that he could not just stand aside and watch everything that was happening. He understood that Katarina could not be allowed to become empress under any circumstances. He knew that he first needed to find his girlfriend and find out what had happened while he was gone. A moment later, the prince saw his friend and ran up to her. He smiled and said that it was very good that he found her. Turning around, she looked at him with a sad and heavy look. The prince was taken aback because he did not understand what had happened to her. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and asked what this all meant. He saw that she was all wounded. The prince was furious. The young lady with tears in her eyes said that it was all no use, and no matter how hard she tried, he would not even admit that she was Yvonne. She understood that she would no longer be able to bring back her lover, Theo. The prince looked closely at his friend and said that she needed to go with him. He said that she could no longer stay in the imperial palace. The young lady froze in bewilderment as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince looked at her and said sadly that she should have run away much earlier. He did not understand why she continued to tolerate the abuse towards herself. She sighed heavily and said that she had nowhere to go. Meanwhile, the emperor was writhing in pain. He was sleeping and he was having nightmares. He saw his beloved, who was burning in the fire. He heard her scream. She said that she was in great pain. The emperor saw her and heard her asking him for help. He was furious. A moment later, he ran towards her and said that he would save her. Now he shouted that he would save her no matter what happened. But a moment later, she looked at him sharply and said it was too late. She screamed that it was all because of him. She screamed that he had angered the empress, and she had taken it out on her. The emperor was shocked because he knew it was entirely his fault. He heard her screaming that she could not forgive him. She screamed that, because of him, her family was dead. The emperor woke up with tears in his eyes and found it difficult to breathe. He sat down on the bed and sighed heavily as he realized that this was just another dream. The emperor sighed heavily as he had not seen her for a long time. He thought that it would be better for him not to think about it. He knew that she was definitely alive. But a moment later, he suddenly felt a flow of power. He noticed that his hands were shaking very strongly. The emperor's assistant looked at him closely and asked if he was all right. The assistant said that he was glad to see him at work, but still he advised the emperor not to overdo it. The man asked the emperor if he was sleeping poorly again. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had enough of this idle chatter. The emperor asked him how things were going. The man felt heavy, sighed, and said that everything remained unchanged. He said that the only survivor, Madame Grace, had returned to her home, and although she was looked after day and night, her illness was so severe that she could hardly speak.